You think you can disrespect her? The voice cut through the officers' mess hall like a blade. Captain Marcus Vale's hand was still raised, frozen mid-air after the slap. Lieutenant Elena Kovač stood there, her cheek red, eyes forward, silent. Then, 4 colonels rose from their corner table in perfect unison. What happened next would become legend. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But let's go back to where it all began. Meet Elena Kovač. 29 years old. Dark auburn hair always pulled back in a regulation bun. Average height, lean build, the kind of woman who could disappear in a crowd if she wanted to. And she often did. Her eyes were an unusual shade of hazel that shifted between green and gold, depending on the light, but most people never looked long enough to notice. She had arrived at Fort Draven 6 months ago with transfer papers that said very little: logistics coordinator. Administrative support, clerical duties. Fort Draven was one of the oldest military installations in the Valerian Republic. Situated in northern mountains where winter came early and stayed late. The base trained elite tactical units, the kind of soldiers who went places that didn't officially exist and did things that were never officially documented. It was a place of hard men with harder reputations, where respect was earned through sweat, blood, and proven capability under impossible conditions. Elena came to Fort Draven with one simple goal: to work quietly in the logistics department, managing supply chains, coordinating equipment transfers, and maintaining inventory systems. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would draw attention. She requested the most mundane assignments: organizing ammunition counts, cataloging medical supplies, updating equipment maintenance logs. The kind of work that made other officers' eyes glaze over with boredom. This place was overwhelmingly male. Of the 847 personnel stationed at Fort Draven, only 63 were women, and most of those were concentrated in medical, communications, or administrative roles. The combat units were almost exclusively men, many of them decorated veterans from the Kandarian conflict, the soulless peacekeeping operations, or the brutal counterinsurgency campaigns in the Morton Highlands. These were soldiers who had seen real combat, who had lost friends, who measured worth and courage under fire and skill in the field. They had a dismissive view of support personnel, especially quiet women who kept to themselves and pushed papers instead of pushing their physical limits. Elena never reacted to their jokes and comments. When someone made a crack about desk jockeys or paper pushers, she simply continued her work. When officers would deliberately leave their gear scattered in the supply room, forcing her to reorganize everything, she did it without complaint. When Captain Vale would forget to sign requisition forms, making her track him down multiple times for the same signature, she remained polite and professional. She managed supply databases, coordinated equipment transfers between units, tracked ammunition expenditures, and ensured that every piece of gear was accounted for down to the last carabiner and bootlace. She arrived before dawn and often left after sunset. She ate alone in the mess hall, usually reading technical manuals or supply catalogs. She kept her quarters immaculate and sparse, just the regulation furnishings. A single photograph on the desk that she always kept face down, and a locked footlocker that no one had ever seen opened. The other personnel called her the ghost behind her back. Not because she was scary, but because she moved through Fort Draven like a shadow, always present, but never noticed. Always helping, but never asking for recognition. Always competent, but never drawing attention to that competence. She would appear exactly when needed with the exact supplies required, then vanish back into her small office in the logistics wing. Elena never spoke about her past, never mentioned where she had served before, never talked about family, friends, or life outside the base. When other soldiers swapped war stories in the mess hall, she ate in silence. When they gathered at the rec room to watch combat footage or discuss tactical scenarios, she was conspicuously absent. Her personnel file was unusually thin for someone her age, just the basic information, a few routine performance reviews, and a series of transfer orders that showed she had moved between different support positions at different bases over the past 7 years. Some soldiers found her silence annoying. Others found it suspicious. But most simply didn't think about her at all. She was furniture, background, the person who made sure they had ammunition for training exercises and medical supplies stocked in the aid stations. Essential, perhaps, but unremarkable. Captain Marcus Vale, the executive officer of the base's most elite tactical unit, the Crimson Raiders, found her particularly easy to ignore. He was the type who measured worth solely in combat capability and physical prowess. Vale was tall, muscular, with the kind of square-jawed confidence that came from never having been truly tested and found wanting. He had a decent service record, 2 deployments, a Bronze Star, several commendations, but nothing that would mark him as exceptional. What he lacked in genuine battlefield brilliance, he compensated for with aggressive posturing and a talent for taking credit for his unit's successes. He used Elena constantly. Kovač, I need these supply requests processed immediately. Kovač, the ammunition count is off again, fix it. Kovač, my tactical vest needs new plate carriers by tomorrow morning. Always demands, never requests. Always immediate deadlines, never reasonable timelines. And always with that same tone that suggested he was doing her a favor by giving her purpose. Elena never responded with anything other than a quiet, yes, sir, and immediate compliance. But those who looked closely, and very few did, might have noticed something in her eyes. Not hurt or anger, but a deep, patient stillness. The kind of patience that comes from carrying a much heavier burden than anyone realizes. The kind of patience that comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when everyone around you has no idea. Late at night, when Fort Draven was quiet except for the sentries on the walls and the wind howling through the mountain passes, Elena would sit alone in the supply office. She would review inventory lists with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Her movements were economical, practiced, almost mechanical in their efficiency. She wore an old military chronograph watch that she never took off, scratched, dented, clearly decades old. Sometimes when she thought no one was looking, she would touch it gently, as if drawing strength from some distant memory. Have you ever been underestimated despite giving your all for others? Have you ever worked in silence while those around you took credit and respect for granted? Drop a comment below if you've ever been the invisible person who kept everything running. You're not alone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Fort Draven operated on a strict hierarchy, and that hierarchy was reinforced every single day through 1,000 small interactions. The combat units, especially the elite tactical teams, sat at the top of that pyramid. They occupied the best barracks, got priority access to training facilities, and commanded respect simply by wearing their unit patches. Below them were the standard infantry companies. Then the specialized support units like engineers and communications. And finally, at the very bottom, the administrative and logistics personnel. The officers' mess hall perfectly reflected this social structure. The Crimson Raiders, Captain Vale's unit, always sat at the large corner table near the windows, the spot with the best lighting and view of the mountains. The other tactical units occupied the surrounding tables. Support staff ate quickly at the tables near the kitchen, often standing rather than sitting, as if they understood they didn't truly belong in the same space as the real soldiers. Captain Marcus Vale ruled his corner of Fort Draven like a petty tyrant. He wasn't the highest-ranking officer on base. That distinction belonged to Colonel Adriana Thorne, the base commander, but among the captains and lieutenants who ran the day-to-day operations, Vale held considerable influence. His unit had a good reputation, They scored well in training exercises, maintained high readiness ratings, and looked sharp during inspections. Vale made sure everyone knew it. He had a particular way of asserting dominance. It wasn't through shouting or obvious cruelty that would have reflected poorly on him. Instead, he used a constant stream of small humiliations and dismissive gestures. A condescending smile here. A public criticism there. Questions designed to embarrass rather than inform. Jokes that landed just on the edge of acceptable but left their targets feeling small. Kovač. His voice would echo through the logistics office, always loud enough for others to hear. Did you actually read the requisition form, or did you just guess at what we needed? This, despite Elena having filled the order exactly as specified. Or, I need someone competent to handle this supply request. Kovač, try not to mess it up this time, said with a grin to his subordinates as if they were all in on the same joke. The other raiders followed their captain's lead. Lieutenant Derek Moss, Vale's second-in-command, had perfected the art of the dismissive grunt. When Elena would deliver supplies to their unit's equipment room, he would barely acknowledge her presence, just a vague gesture toward wherever he wanted items placed. Never a thank you, or even basic eye contact. Sergeant First Class Anton Reeves would make a show of inspecting everything Elena delivered, loudly questioning the quality or quantity, implying incompetence even when everything was perfect. But it wasn't just the Crimson Raiders. The attitude spread throughout the tactical units like a contagion. Other officers saw how Vale treated logistics personnel and concluded it must be acceptable behavior. After all, he was successful, respected by his peers, and seemingly untouchable. Private First Class Hannah Chun from the communications unit once tried to defend Elena during a particularly harsh public criticism from Vale. Sir, Lieutenant Kovač actually saved our unit last month when she expedited those replacement radio components. We would have missed our deployment window without her. Vale had turned his cold smile on Chun. That's her job, Private. You want a medal for doing your job? Neither does she. The implied threat was clear. Defend the logistics, staff, and find yourself on the outside of the unofficial power structure that really ran Fort Draven. Chun never spoke up again. Neither did anyone else. The pattern became predictable. Elena would complete assignments perfectly, and Vale would find fault anyway. She would work overtime to accommodate last-minute requests, and Vale would complain about the speed of service. She would anticipate needs before they were voiced, and Vale would dismiss it as finally doing the bare minimum. During weekly briefings, when various units reported on their status and needs, Vale had a habit of interrupting whenever Elena spoke. Yes, we all know logistics has everything under control, he would say with exaggerated patience, as if she were wasting everyone's time with unnecessary details. Can we move on to matters that actually affect operational readiness? The other officers would chuckle uncomfortably. Some looked away. None objected. Elena's direct supervisor, Major Robert Weston, was a decent man but politically cautious. He appreciated Elena's work ethic and competence, but he wasn't willing to create conflict with the tactical units over interpersonal dynamics. When Elena submitted her monthly reports, he would review them carefully and note his appreciation, but always in private. In public settings, he maintained a careful neutrality, never defending her, but never actively participating in the mockery either. Just keep your head down and do good work, Weston advised her once, after a particularly difficult interaction with Vale. The tactical guys have their culture. It's not worth fighting. Your work speaks for itself, but did it? Elena's work was consistently excellent. 0 inventory discrepancies, 100% on-time supply deliveries, innovative solutions to chronic equipment shortages, yet none of that seemed to matter. The same officers who depended on her competence daily were the first to dismiss her value. The base had a tradition called the copper mug, awarded monthly to the service member who had gone above and beyond their duties. It rotated among the tactical units almost exclusively. In the 18 months since the tradition had started, not a single support staff member had received it. 3 months ago, Major Weston had nominated Elena for her work coordinating an emergency resupply operation during a training accident. The nomination was quietly set aside. Instead, the mug went to a raider who had scored well on a marksmanship qualifier. The physical environment reinforced the hierarchy too. The tactical units had access to state-of-the-art training facilities, well-maintained equipment, and comfortable common areas. The logistics office where Elena worked was in the oldest part of Fort Draven, a converted storage building with poor heating, flickering fluorescent lights, and ancient computers that crashed regularly. Requests for upgrades were perpetually under review. Even the small courtesies that make military life tolerable were denied to support staff. When the mess hall served the good meals, steak nights, holiday dinners, the tactical units went through the line first. By the time support staff arrived, portions were smaller and options limited. When new recreational equipment arrived, it went to the tactical units' common areas. When base housing assignments were made, combat personnel got priority. Vale seemed to take particular pleasure in finding new ways to make Elena's job harder. He would submit supply requests with missing information, then complain when she asked for clarification. He would change equipment specifications at the last minute, then act outraged when the original order arrived. He would schedule emergency requisitions late on Friday afternoons, forcing Elena to work weekends, then never acknowledge the extra effort. One winter morning, Vale accidentally knocked over Elena's carefully organized supply cart in the equipment bay, scattering specialized gear across the floor. "Oh, sorry, Kovač," he said without a trace of sincerity. "Didn't see you there. You really should be more careful about where you position things." His raiders laughed as Elena silently knelt to gather the scattered equipment. She never responded to the mockery, never complained, never showed frustration. She would simply nod, say, "Yes, sir," or "I'll take care of it, sir," and continue her work with the same quiet efficiency. Her face remained neutral, professional, giving Vale and his followers nothing to feed on. No reaction to escalate. But if anyone had looked closely at her eyes during those moments, and no one did, they might have seen something that wasn't quite resignation. A kind of measured assessment. The gaze of someone who sees everything, forgets nothing, and waits patiently for the moment when accounts come due. The Fort Draven culture had been carefully constructed over years. Combat personnel mattered. Everyone else was support infrastructure. And Elena Kovač, the quiet logistics officer who never pushed back, who never demanded respect, who seemed content to exist in the shadows, fit perfectly into the role they had assigned her. She was, in their eyes, exactly what she appeared to be: unremarkable, forgettable, and ultimately unimportant. They had no idea how catastrophically wrong they were. It was a Tuesday morning in late November when everything changed, though no one realized it at the time. Fort Draven's training schedule had been disrupted by an early winter storm that had rolled through the mountains, dumping 3 feet of snow overnight and making the outdoor ranges unusable. The tactical units were forced indoors, running through combat simulations, equipment maintenance, and administrative tasks they normally avoided. Captain Vale's Crimson Raiders were in the main equipment bay, preparing for an upcoming joint exercise with another base. They needed specialized cold weather gear, night vision equipment, and updated communication systems. The requisition was massive, nearly 40 different items, each with specific technical requirements. Vale had submitted the request only 2 days prior. Despite knowing about the exercise for 3 weeks, Elena had worked 16-hour days to pull it together. She had called in favors from supply depots across 3 military districts, expedited shipping on critical items, and personally verified every piece of equipment against the technical specifications. Everything was ready, organized on 6 rolling carts in perfect order. Each item labeled and cross-referenced to the requisition list. She was in the equipment bay at 0600 hours, having arrived early to ensure everything was in place before the raiders showed up for their 0700 briefing. The bay was a massive space with high ceilings, concrete floors, and rows of industrial shelving containing everything from spare rifle parts to cold weather tents. At this hour, it was empty and quiet. Just the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of the mess hall preparing breakfast. The raiders arrived in their typical fashion, loud, confident, taking up space. Vale walked in first, scanning the organized carts with the expression of someone looking for a problem to solve. Lieutenant Moss and Sergeant Reeves flanked him, along with 8 other unit members. They began going through the equipment, checking items off against their internal list. "Kovač," Vale said without looking at her. "These NVG batteries, are they the lithium-ion or the standard alkaline?" Elena stepped forward, referencing her clipboard. "Lithium-ion, sir. As specified in the requisition form. They provide better performance in cold weather conditions and have a longer operational life." "I don't remember specifying lithium-ion," Vale said, his tone shifting to that dangerous edge that suggested a public embarrassment was coming. "Line item 17 of the requisition, sir," Elena replied evenly. "Submitted via the supply portal on November 19th at 14:37 hours. The specification reads, NVG batteries, lithium-ion, cold weather rated. Quantity 48. I can pull up the original submission if you need verification." One of the younger raiders, Corporal James Hendricks, glanced at his tablet and nodded. "She's right, sir. It's in the original rec." Vale's jaw tightened slightly, but he moved on. "And the thermal imaging scopes? We need the Mark IV models, not the older Mark IIIs. "All 6 scopes are Mark IV, sir," Elena said. She walked to the 3rd cart and indicated the equipment cases. "Received from the Aberdeen Supply Depot 3 days ago. Each unit has been function tested and calibrated. The test results are in the documentation folder attached to each case." Sergeant Reeves picked up one of the cases, opened it, and examined the scope. He was an experienced equipment specialist and knew quality when he saw it. The scope was pristine, properly maintained, with all accessories present and organized. He said nothing, but his expression shifted slightly, a grudging acknowledgement of competent work. The inspection continued for another 20 minutes. Vale searched methodically for errors, discrepancies, or oversights. He found none. Every item was present, every specification was met, every piece of equipment was in excellent condition. The documentation was perfect. The organization was flawless. Even the packing made sense, items grouped by function, with related accessories kept together. But then Corporal Hendricks opened one of the communications equipment cases and frowned. "Lieutenant Kovač, this tactical radio, the frequency range seems off." Elena moved to his position immediately. Hendricks showed her the radio's display panel, which was showing an error code. "It's reading a restricted frequency band. We can't use this for the exercise." Several raiders gathered around, sensing potential drama. Vale's expression shifted to something almost satisfied finally. "A mistake." Elena took the radio from Hendricks and examined it carefully. Her fingers moved across the control panel with surprising familiarity. Not the tentative pressing of someone consulting a manual, but the confident manipulation of someone who had used this equipment extensively. She powered down the unit, removed the battery pack, waited exactly 3 seconds, then reinstalled it and powered it back up while holding down a specific combination of buttons. The radio went through its boot sequence, and the error code disappeared. The display now showed the correct frequency range. "The RT740 series has a known firmware quirk," Elena explained. her voice quiet but assured. If it's powered down for more than 72 hours, the frequency parameters sometimes default to training mode, which restricts the band to prevent accidental transmission on active military frequencies. The reset procedure clears it and restores operational parameters. She handed the radio back to Hendricks. If you experience the same issue with any of the other units, the reset sequence is power down. Remove battery, 3-second wait, reinstall battery. Then power up while holding the menu and select buttons simultaneously for 5 seconds. It's documented in the Technical Manual, Section 4.7. But most field operators don't know about it because it's not a common occurrence. Hendricks stared at her, then at the now functioning radio. How do you know that? The technical documentation for all issued equipment is available through the supply database. Corporal, Elena said simply. I make it a point to be familiar with the gear I'm responsible for distributing. But it wasn't just that she knew the information, it was how she had handled the radio. The confidence in her movements, the precise timing of the reset procedure, the way she had manipulated the controls without hesitation. Several of the raiders exchanged glances. That wasn't the behavior of someone who had just read about equipment. That was the behavior of someone who had used it extensively in the field. Lieutenant Moss, who had been relatively quiet during the inspection, spoke up. That reset procedure isn't in the standard operator's manual. That's advanced technical knowledge. Where exactly did you learn that? Elena's expression didn't change, but there was the briefest pause before she answered. Extended technical documentation, sir. Available to logistics coordinators with appropriate clearance levels. It was a perfectly reasonable answer. It was also, several of the more observant raiders would later realize, not actually an answer to the question that had been asked. Sergeant. Reeves picked up one of the cold weather rifle cases and examined it closely. These weren't standard issue items, they were specialized equipment, used by elite reconnaissance units operating in extreme environments. Kovač, these cases have been modified. There are custom foam inserts here that aren't part of the standard configuration. Correct, Sergeant, Elena confirmed. The standard foam inserts don't adequately protect the thermal optics during transport in sub-zero temperatures. The custom inserts provide better cushioning and thermal insulation. The modifications were done in accordance with Technical Bulletin TB 430142, which specifically authorizes logistics personnel to implement approved protective measures for sensitive equipment. Reeves looked at the inserts more carefully. The work was professional grade, exactly the kind of modification that experienced field operators made to protect expensive gear. You did this yourself? The modifications were completed per the Technical Bulletin specifications, Sergeant. Again, technically an answer. Again, not really answering the underlying question. Vale was watching this exchange with growing irritation. His attempt to find fault with Elena's work had not only failed, but had somehow resulted in his own people looking impressed by her competence. All right, the gear is acceptable. We'll begin loading it for transport. Sir, Elena said, if I might suggest, the thermal scope should be stored separately from the communications equipment during transport. The COM systems generate minor, electromagnetic interference that can affect the calibration of the thermal sensors if they're in close proximity for extended periods. It's a minor issue, but for optimal performance, I think we know how to transport our own equipment. Kovač, Vale cut her off sharply. We've been doing this a lot longer than you've been pushing papers. Yes. Sir, Elena replied, stepping back, but Sergeant Reeves, who had been doing this job for 15 years and had seen equipment failures from exactly the kind of issue Elena had just described, quietly made a note on his tablet. When they loaded the transport vehicle later, the thermal scopes and communications equipment would be packed in separate containers. The raiders began moving the equipment carts toward the loading bay. Elena returned to her small office adjacent to the equipment bay, already pulling up the next requisition on her computer. To all external appearances, it was just another routine equipment issue. Competently handled, quickly forgotten. But Corporal Hendricks, who had a habit of noticing things others missed, kept thinking about the way Elena had handled that radio. The confidence, the precision, the specific knowledge that went beyond what any manual contained. And he remembered something else, the way her hands had moved across the controls. Those weren't the hands of someone who had practiced on a simulator. Those were the hands of someone who had manipulated that exact radio in high-pressure situations, where mistakes meant consequences. He mentioned it to Moss later that day. Quietly, when they were alone in the equipment bay doing final load checks. "Did you see how she handled that radio reset?" Hendricks asked. That wasn't textbook knowledge. That was field experience. Moss had been thinking the same thing. Logistics coordinators don't get field experience with tactical communications equipment, Hendricks. She probably just studied the manuals thoroughly. Maybe, Hendricks said, but he didn't sound convinced. Or maybe her service record isn't as boring as everyone assumes. They left it at that. Neither of them pursued the question further. Neither of them mentioned the odd familiarity Elena had shown with equipment that support staff should never have touched outside of a warehouse setting. Neither of them thought to look deeper into the personnel file of the quiet logistics officer, who seemed to know far more than she should. They would remember this conversation later, when everything came into focus. They would remember and realize that the signs had been there all along. They had just been too focused on dismissing her to actually see her. Elena Kovač worked in the shadows because that's where she chose to be. But shadows can only hide you if people aren't looking closely. And for just a few minutes that morning, a couple of observant raiders had looked a little too closely and seen something that didn't quite fit the narrative everyone had constructed about who she was. The question was whether anyone would pursue it. Whether anyone would ask the questions that Elena had spent 6 months carefully avoiding. The answer, as it turned out, wouldn't matter, because what was coming would force the truth into the open, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The nickname started 3 days after the equipment inspection incident. And like most cruel things, it began as a joke that wasn't really a joke at all. Captain Vale was holding court in the officers' mess hall during the lunch hour, surrounded by his usual entourage of raiders and other tactical unit officers. The conversation had turned to the upcoming joint exercise, and someone mentioned how smoothly the equipment requisition had gone despite the short timeline. "That's because we have our own personal quartermaster know-nothing handling our supplies," Vale announced loudly enough for half the mess hall to hear. He gestured vaguely in the direction of the support staff tables where Elena sat alone, eating her meal and reading a supply catalog. "She doesn't know anything about actual combat operations, but at least she can count inventory and read labels." The table erupted in laughter. Lieutenant Moss added, "Give her credit, sir, she can also look up technical manuals when we point out her mistakes." "True," Vale conceded with mock generosity. "Quartermaster Know-Nothing does have excellent reading comprehension skills. Very important for someone whose entire military experience comes from sitting behind a desk." The name stuck immediately, spreading through the tactical units with the infectious speed of barracks humor. By dinner that same evening, soldiers from 3 different units were using it. By the next morning, it had become Elena's unofficial call sign throughout Fort Draven. "Hey, Quartermaster Know-Nothing, we need ammunition for the range tomorrow." "Quartermaster Know-Nothing, the medical supplies need restocking. Has anyone seen Quartermaster Know-Nothing? We need requisition forms signed." Some soldiers used it with genuine mockery, enjoying the implied superiority of their combat roles over her administrative position. Others used it more casually, not from malice but from social conformity. Everyone else was saying it, so it must be acceptable. A few younger enlisted personnel looked uncomfortable when they heard it, but said nothing. unwilling to challenge the culture that combat officers had established. Major Weston heard the nickname being used within 48 hours and was troubled by it, but he was also pragmatic about base politics. He pulled Elena aside one afternoon in the logistics office, closing the door for privacy. "Lieutenant Kovač," he began carefully, "I want you to know that I don't approve of this quartermaster know-nothing business. It's unprofessional and disrespectful." Elena looked up from the inventory spreadsheet she was updating. Her expression was neutral, unreadable. "It's just a nickname, sir." "It's a deliberate insult," Weston corrected. "And it's coming from Captain Vale. If you want to file a complaint, I don't, sir." Weston frowned. "Elena, you don't have to accept this kind of treatment. There are proper channels. Major, with respect." "Filing a complaint would make my job harder, not easier," Elena said quietly. "Captain Vale and his unit are some of our biggest equipment users. Creating conflict over a nickname would compromise my ability to work effectively with the tactical units. I'd rather just do my job. Your job shouldn't include tolerating abuse." "It's not abuse, sir. It's just words." Elena's tone was perfectly calm, almost detached. "I've handled worse." That last statement caught Weston's attention. "What do you mean, you've handled worse?" Elena seemed to realize she'd said more than intended. "Just that nicknames aren't the end of the world, sir. I'm fine. I appreciate your concern, but I'd prefer to let it go." Weston wanted to press further, but he also recognized that Elena was an adult who could make her own decisions about how to respond to workplace dynamics. "All right," he said reluctantly. "But if things escalate, if it becomes more than just a stupid nickname, I want you to tell me." "That's an order." "Yes, sir." But things were already escalating, just not in ways that Weston could easily observe or address. Vale began using the nickname exclusively when addressing Elena, even in formal settings. During weekly supply briefings with multiple unit representatives present, he would say things like, "And here's Quartermaster Know-Nothing to bore us with." Inventory updates, before Elena even had a chance to speak. During equipment requisition reviews, he would make exaggerated shows of patience. Explain it slowly, Quartermaster Know-Nothing. Use small words so those of us who actually serve in combat roles can follow your complex logistics theories. The other officers would laugh, some genuinely amused, others uncomfortably but unwilling to break ranks. Elena would simply continue with her presentation, her voice steady, her demeanor unchanged. She never acknowledged the nickname, never. Reacted to the mockery, never gave Vale the satisfaction of a visible response. This lack of reaction seemed to frustrate Vale more than any comeback would have. He began inserting the nickname into increasingly inappropriate contexts, testing boundaries to see what would finally provoke a response dot in the equipment bay. When Elena was helping a young private locate specific gear, "Private, you're in good hands with Quartermaster Know-Nothing here. She may not know the first thing about combat, but she's excellent at finding things on shelves." During a base-wide safety briefing about proper ammunition handling procedures, "I'm sure Quartermaster Know-Nothing has read all about ammunition safety in her technical manuals. That's basically the same as actually handling live ordnance in combat conditions, right?" At the morning formation when various personnel were receiving recognition for completed training certifications, "Too bad we don't give out medals for sitting in offices." Quartermaster Know-Nothing would have a chest full of them. The constant repetition had its intended effect on base culture. Younger enlisted personnel began to unconsciously adopt the same dismissive attitude toward logistics staff. If a captain could openly mock a lieutenant, a commissioned officer, for doing support work, then clearly that work had no real value. The nickname became shorthand for a broader message: combat roles matter. Everything else is just bureaucratic overhead. Sergeant First Class Maria Delgado, from the motor pool, witnessed one particularly egregious incident during a requisition pickup. Elena had prepared a complex vehicle parts order for the raiders' transport, truck-specialized components that had taken significant effort to source and expedite. When Sergeant Reeves arrived to collect the parts, Vale accompanied him, apparently just to maximize the opportunity for public mockery. "Quartermaster Know Nothing," Vale announced as they entered the supply depot. "I hope you've managed to get the correct parts this time. I know distinguishing between different types of mechanical components can be challenging for someone whose closest encounter with vehicles involves requisitioning office supplies." Elena was standing at the parts counter with 6 organized bins of components, each labeled with part numbers, quantities, and installation references. "All requested parts are present and accounted for, Captain," she said evenly. Each bin corresponds to a specific vehicle system: transmission, electrical, suspension, cooling, and hydraulic. The parts are organized by installation sequence to facilitate efficient maintenance procedures. Reeves, who had expected a typical jumbled parts delivery, was visibly impressed by the organization. This level of preparation would save his mechanics hours of sorting and verification time. But Vale wasn't interested in the quality of work. "How thoughtful," he said with exaggerated appreciation. "Quartermaster Know Nothing has learned to organize things in the order mechanics might find useful. It's almost like she's read a vehicle maintenance manual. Someone give her a participation trophy." Delgado, watching from across the depot where she was checking in her own supply order, felt her jaw tighten. She was a 15-year veteran who had served 2 combat deployments and earned her position through competence and dedication. She had no patience for officers who built themselves up by tearing others down. But she also understood military hierarchy and the unwritten rules about when junior NCOs could challenge captain-level officers. This wasn't her fight, and intervening would only create problems for everyone involved, including Elena. Still, she made a point of catching Elena's eye as Vale and Reeves left with the parts. A small nod of solidarity, one professional to another. Elena returned the gesture with the faintest acknowledgement, then returned to her work as if nothing had happened. The nickname followed Elena everywhere now. In the mess hall, in the equipment bays, during briefings, even in official memoranda where Vale would deliberately use it instead of her proper rank and name. Forwarding supply request to Quartermaster Know Nothing for processing. Quartermaster Know Nothing will coordinate transport arrangements. Questions regarding equipment availability should be directed to Quartermaster Know Nothing. What made it particularly insidious was that the nickname contained just enough plausible deniability to make formal complaints difficult. Vale could argue, if ever challenged, that Quartermaster was a legitimate reference to her logistics role, and that Know Nothing was just playful banter common in military culture. The fact that he used it constantly, that he encouraged others to use it, that he deployed it specifically to undermine and diminish, all of that could be dismissed as subjective interpretation. Elena's response remained consistent, no reaction whatsoever. She answered to Quartermaster Know Nothing, the same way she answered to Lieutenant Kovač, or Logistics Coordinator, or any other form of address. She never corrected anyone, never asked them to use her proper name, never showed the slightest indication that the nickname bothered her. Her face remained neutral. Her voice stayed steady and professional. Her work continued at the same high standard. She moved through Fort Draven like a ghost, present but somehow apart, helping everyone while asking nothing in return, absorbing endless mockery without defending herself. But late at night, alone in her quarters, Elena would sit at her small desk and look at that face-down photograph. Sometimes she would turn it over and study the image for long minutes, her expression unreadable. Then she would turn it face down again, touch the old chronograph watch on her wrist, and return to her work with the same quiet determination. Have you ever had someone give you a cruel nickname that everyone else thought was funny? Have you ever been reduced to a joke while doing your job with excellence? Drop a comment about how you handled it, because sometimes staying silent isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the most powerful choice you can make. The nickname would stick for the next 3 weeks. Used casually by dozens of people who had no idea they were speaking to someone far more capable and dangerous than they could possibly imagine. Used carelessly by soldiers who thought they understood military excellence, but had never actually seen it embodied in its truest form. Used, most often, by Captain Marcus Vale, who believed he was asserting dominance over a subordinate, too weak or timid to push back. He had no idea that Elena Kovač wasn't weak. She wasn't timid. She wasn't reacting because she was measuring him, assessing him, and waiting patiently for the moment when his arrogance would finally cross a line that couldn't be ignored. That moment was coming, soon, and when it arrived, the nickname Quartermaster Know Nothing would die on the same day that everything else at Fort Draven changed forever. The winter at Fort Draven grew harsher as December approached. The mountains were buried under layers of snow and ice, and the temperature regularly dropped below freezing even during daylight hours. The base took on a different character in deep winter, more isolated, more insular, with personnel spending longer hours indoors and social dynamics intensifying in the confined spaces. Elena's routine remained unchanged. She arrived at the logistics office before dawn, worked through the day with methodical precision, and often stayed late into the evening completing paperwork and organizing inventory. She ate her meals alone, maintained her quarters with military precision, and interacted with others only when necessary for work purposes. But something was shifting beneath the surface of Fort Draven's daily operations. Something most people couldn't see, but a few perceptive individuals were beginning to sense. Sergeant Maria Delgado noticed it first. She had been watching Elena more carefully since that incident in the supply depot, not out of suspicion but out of professional curiosity. Delgado had spent enough years in the military to recognize when someone was carrying themselves in a way that didn't quite match their official role. One afternoon, Delgado was in the vehicle maintenance bay working at a transport truck's hydraulic system when she heard voices from the adjacent storage area. Elena was helping a young specialist named Tommy Ruiz locate some replacement parts for a communications array. Ruiz was new to Fort Draven, barely 20 years old, still learning the complex inventory systems. "I can't find the RF amplifier modules anywhere." "Ma'am," Ruiz was saying, frustration evident in his voice. "The database says they're in section D7. But I've checked 3 times and they're not there." "The database hasn't been updated since the last reorganization," Elena's quiet voice responded. "The RF modules were moved to section G12 to keep them with the other communications components. It makes more functional sense that way." "Oh, thank you, ma'am. I'll check there." "Specialist Ruiz," Elena continued, and something in her tone made Delgado pause her work to listen more carefully. "While you're retrieving those modules, verify the serial numbers against the equipment compatibility list. The AN PRC152 radios your unit uses require specific amplifier versions. If you install an incompatible module, you'll get signal degradation that won't show up immediately, but will cause communication failures in the field." There was a pause. "I didn't know that, ma'am. How do I verify compatibility?" "The serial numbers on the modules have a 3-digit suffix code. For the PRC152 systems, you need modules with suffix codes between 400 and 499. Anything outside that range is for different radio systems. The compatibility list is technically available in the equipment database, but it's buried in subsection documentation that most people don't read." Another pause, longer this time. "Ma'am, that's really specific information. How do you know all that?" Elena's response came after the briefest hesitation. Technical documentation specialist. It's important to understand the equipment we're responsible for distributing. But Delgado, listening from the maintenance bay, knew that answer didn't fully explain the depth and specificity of Elena's knowledge. That wasn't information you got from reading manuals. That was field experience. The kind of detailed understanding that came from actually using communications, equipment in operational environments where compatibility issues could mean the difference between mission success and failure. Delgado didn't mention what she'd overheard, but she filed it away in her memory alongside the other small inconsistencies she'd noticed about the quiet logistics officer. Corporal James Hendricks had his own growing collection of observations. Since the radio reset incident, he'd been paying more attention to Elena's interactions with equipment and personnel. What he noticed was subtle but consistent. Elena moved through the base with an awareness that seemed out of place for someone in a support role. She never walked with her head down or her attention scattered. Her gaze constantly tracked her surroundings, noting details and assessing situations with the kind of environmental awareness that combat veterans developed through years of operating in threat environments. When she entered a room, her eyes would scan the space systematically, exits, potential hazards, people present before. She focused on whatever task had brought her there. It was the kind of behavior that was so ingrained it had become unconscious. The kind of thing that marked someone who had trained extensively in tactical awareness and couldn't turn it off even in safe environments. Hendricks mentioned it to Sergeant Reeves one evening when they were conducting equipment inventory together. "Have you noticed how Kovač moves? The way she scans rooms when she enters? That's not normal civilian behavior." Reeves, who had been thinking similar thoughts but keeping them to himself, grunted noncommittally. Lots of military personnel develop situational awareness. Doesn't mean anything special. Yeah, but she's supposed to be career logistics. When would she have developed that kind of tactical awareness? It's not something you learn from managing inventory databases. Maybe she did some security training at a previous posting, Reeves suggested, though he didn't sound entirely convinced by his own explanation. Maybe, Hendricks agreed. But both men were left with the sense that there was something about Elena Kovač that didn't quite add up. Some piece of her history that was missing from the simple narrative everyone had constructed about the quiet, competent, dismissible logistics officer. The questions might have eventually led somewhere. Might have prompted someone to dig deeper into Elena's service record or ask more pointed questions about her background. But Fort Draven's social dynamics didn't encourage that kind of curiosity about support staff. Elena was useful, efficient, and non-threatening. Why complicate that simple understanding with uncomfortable questions? Besides, Captain Vale's constant mockery had established the accepted narrative. Elena was a desk officer with no real military capability. Someone who pushed papers and read manuals, but had never done anything that actually mattered. That narrative was comfortable, reinforced daily, and supported by Elena's own consistent refusal to draw attention to herself or claim any special competence. So the small observations remained scattered among different people, disconnected pieces of a puzzle that no one was trying to assemble. Delgado had her suspicions. Hendricks had his questions. Reeves had his doubts. But none of them talked to each other about it. None of them pursued their curiosities. And none of them imagined that these small inconsistencies were clues to something far more significant. Meanwhile, Elena continued her routine with the same quiet dedication. She processed requisitions, coordinated supply chains, maintained equipment inventories, and absorbed mockery without complaint. The nickname Quartermaster Know-Nothing was now so ubiquitous that some newer personnel didn't even know her real name. But there were moments, brief, easily missed, when something else showed through the carefully maintained facade. Private First Class Sarah Chun, working late one night on a supply audit, witnessed one such moment. She had been struggling with a jammed storage locker in the equipment bay, trying various methods to get the lock mechanism unstuck without damaging it. After 20 minutes of frustration, she was about to give up and call maintenance when Elena appeared beside her. "Let me try," Elena said quietly. Before Chun could respond, Elena had assessed the lock mechanism, identified the jam point, and manipulated the release with a series of precise movements that took perhaps 5 seconds. The locker opened smoothly. "How did you?" Chun started to ask. "The Model 7 series lockers have a tendency to jam when the temperature drops," Elena explained. "The metal contracts slightly and the internal pins can bind. If you apply pressure to the top corner while turning the handle, it releases the tension on the pins." It was a reasonable explanation. But what caught Chun's attention was the speed and confidence of Elena's movements. She hadn't fumbled with the lock or tried multiple approaches. She had known exactly what to do, moved with practiced efficiency, and executed the solution flawlessly. That wasn't the behavior of someone who had learned a trick from a manual. That was muscle memory, the kind that came from having dealt with jammed locks dozens or hundreds of times under various conditions. "Thank you." "Ma'am," Chun said, studying Elena more carefully. Elena nodded and turned to leave. But Chun's curiosity got the better of her caution. "Lieutenant Kovač, can I ask you something?" Elena paused, turning back with that neutral, patient expression she always wore. "Of course, Private. Why do you let them call you that nickname?" "Quartermaster Know-Nothing. You're a commissioned officer. You could order them to stop." For just a moment, something flickered in Elena's hazel eyes, not anger or hurt, but something deeper and harder to define. Then it was gone, replaced by the same calm neutrality. "Because names don't matter, Private Chun," Elena said quietly. "Results matter. I do my job well. I help people get what they need to do their jobs well. What anyone chooses to call me while that's happening is irrelevant, but it's disrespectful." "Respect isn't given through names or titles," Elena replied. "It's earned through actions when actions actually matter. Right now, what matters is making sure you can complete your audit and get some sleep. Everything else is just noise." She left before Chun could ask anything more. Disappearing into the shadows of the equipment bay like the ghost they all claimed she was, Chun stood there for a long moment, thinking about what Elena had said. There was something almost philosophical about it, a perspective that suggested experience with situations far more serious than base politics and hurt feelings. It was the kind of wisdom that came from seeing real consequences, from understanding the difference between petty indignities and actual threats. Have you ever kept quiet when people underestimated you, knowing that their opinions didn't define your worth? Have you ever chosen patience over defending yourself, waiting for the moment when your actions would speak louder than any words? Share in the comments if you've ever had to swallow your pride and trust that the truth would eventually reveal itself. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. The small observations continued to accumulate. A maintenance technician noticed that Elena could field strip and reassemble a standard issue rifle faster than most infantry soldiers. A medical staff member saw her correctly diagnose a complex equipment malfunction that had stumped 3 other technicians. A supply sergeant watched her navigate a complex multi-agency requisition system with the kind of expertise that typically took years to develop, but these observations remained isolated, disconnected, unremarkable in themselves. And the overarching narrative reinforced daily by Captain Vale's mockery remained firmly in place. Elena Kovač was Quartermaster Know-Nothing, a competent but unremarkable logistics officer who knew her place and stayed in her lane. What no one at Fort Draven understood was that Elena wasn't hiding because she was afraid of confrontation. She was hiding because she had made a choice 3 years ago to leave behind a life that had cost her more than most people could imagine. She had chosen peace over conflict, service over glory, anonymity over recognition. But every choice has its limits. Every patience has its breaking point. And the difference between choosing silence and being forced into submission was a line that Elena had drawn in her mind. Long ago, that line hadn't been crossed yet, but it was about to be, and when it was, everyone at Fort Draven, from the newest private to the most senior, colonel, would finally understand that the quiet woman they had dismissed and mocked for 6 months was something they had never imagined. The countdown had already begun. They just didn't know it yet. That evening, Elena sat alone in her quarters as she did most nights. The room was sparse and orderly, a narrow bed with military-tight corners, a small desk with a laptop and neatly organized paperwork, a single chair, and a footlocker pushed against the wall. The only personal items visible were the face-down photograph on the desk and the old chronograph watch she never removed. From her wrist, she had finished her daily reports and was reviewing tomorrow's supply schedule when her hand drifted to the photograph. For a long moment, she hesitated, then slowly turned it face up. The image showed a woman in full combat gear standing beside a man in a colonel's uniform. Both were smiling, though their eyes carried the weight of people who had seen things that couldn't be unseen. The woman in the photograph was younger, maybe 25 or 26, but unmistakably Elena. Her hair was shorter then, pulled back in a tactical braid. She wore the insignia of a specialized reconnaissance unit, and on her chest was a collection of ribbons and medals that would have made most career officers envious. The man beside her was Colonel Elena Kovač, her father. Not her biological father, she had never known him, but the man who had found her as a teenager in a refugee camp in Candaria, seen something in her that no one else had, and given her a purpose when she had nothing. Elena touched the photograph gently, her finger tracing her father's face. Elena Kovač had been a legend in the Valerian Republic's military, a tactical genius who had served in every major conflict for 3 decades, earning respect from allies and enemies alike. He had trained hundreds of soldiers, mentored dozens of officers, and saved countless lives through his strategic brilliance and unwavering principles. He had also been the kindest man Elena had ever known. She remembered the day he had arrived at the refugee camp 15 years ago. She had been 17 years old, alone, traumatized by the civil war that had destroyed her hometown and killed everyone she loved. She was surviving, but not living, going through the motions of existence without hope or direction. Victor had been there as part of a peacekeeping operation, coordinating humanitarian aid. Most officers stayed in the command tents and dealt with logistics. Victor walked through the camps, talking to people, listening to their stories. When he met Elena, something in her eyes, that same hard stillness that people at Fort Draven saw, but never understood, caught his attention. "What's your name?" he had asked in her native language, crouching down to her eye level despite his rank and decorated uniform. "Elena." "Elena, do you want to keep surviving, or do you want to start living again?" It was a strange question, the kind that only made sense if you understood the difference between breathing and actually being alive. Elena had looked at this foreign colonel with his kind eyes and military bearing, and for the first time in months, she had felt something other than numbness. "I don't know how to live anymore," she had admitted. "Then let me teach you," Victor had said simply, and he had. He had navigated the complex legal systems to officially adopt her, brought her to the Valerian Republic, and given her a home. But more than that, he had given her purpose. He hadn't just seen a broken refugee girl. He had seen potential, strength, and a fierce intelligence that trauma had temporarily buried. Elena closed her eyes, remembering those early years. Victor had started her training slowly, carefully, building not just physical skills, but mental resilience and emotional healing. He had been a demanding teacher, but never cruel, pushing her to excellence while always making clear that her worth wasn't measured by her performance. "You're not training to be a weapon," he would tell her during their early morning sessions. "You're training to be someone who protects others. There's a difference." A weapon is used by someone else's hand. A protector makes their own choices about when and how to act. By the time Elena was 20, she was one of the most capable reconnaissance operators in the Valyrian military. She could navigate any terrain, operate any weapon system, speak 4 languages fluently, and had the kind of tactical intelligence that made veteran officers seek her input. She had served in the Specialized Reconnaissance Regiment des SR, an elite unit that conducted high-risk operations in denied territory. For 8 years, she had been exceptional at it. Her call sign had been Phantom, a tribute to her father's own legendary status and her ability to move through hostile territory without detection. She had received commendations for valor, been promoted rapidly, and earned the respect of some of the military's most elite operators. But it had come at a cost that few people understood. Every mission took something from you, small pieces of your humanity, tiny fragments of the person you used to be. You learned to make impossible decisions, to live with consequences that haunted your quiet moments, to carry the weight of actions that served necessary purposes but violated fundamental parts of your soul. Victor had understood that cost better than anyone. He had paid it himself over 3 decades of service. And he had watched his daughter begin to pay it too. 3 years ago, everything had changed. Elena's hand moved to the old chronograph watch on her wrist, her fingers tracing its worn surface. This had been Victor's watch, carried through every deployment, every mission, every moment of his legendary career. The Solus operation had been supposed to be routine, a peacekeeping mission in a region that had achieved fragile stability after years of conflict. Victor had been there as a senior advisor, helping train local security forces. Elena had been in a different theater entirely, conducting reconnaissance operations in the Morton Highlands. The attack had come without warning. An extremist group that everyone thought had been neutralized launched a coordinated assault on the peacekeeping compound. Victor had been in the operations center when the explosives breached the walls. He had died doing what he had always done, protecting others. According to the survivors' reports, he had held a defensive position that allowed 17 people to evacuate safely before the building collapsed. They found him buried in rubble, still at his post, his rifle empty of ammunition. Elena had been extracted from her own mission and flown back for the funeral. She had stood at attention in her dress uniform, surrounded by generals and decorated veterans, all of them offering condolences and praising Victor's heroism. She had accepted their words with the same stoic composure she showed everything else, never breaking, never showing the devastation that was consuming her from the inside. But that night, alone in her quarters, she had made a decision. She looked at her own chest full of medals and ribbons, thought about all the missions and operations and tactical successes, and realized that none of it mattered if the people you loved still died in collapsed buildings while you were thousands of miles away. Victor had spent his life protecting others and teaching Elena to do the same. But he had also told her something during one of their last conversations before she deployed to the Highlands. Elena, there are different ways to serve. The reconnaissance work you do is important, but don't let anyone convince you that it's the only important work. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is be present for the people who need you, rather than being exceptional at things that take you far away. She had thought about those words constantly in the months after his death, and slowly, carefully, she had begun the process of leaving the SRR and transitioning to support roles. It hadn't been easy. Her commanders had tried to convince her to stay, arguing that losing an operator of her caliber weakened the regiment. But Elena had been firm in her decision. She had spent the next 3 years deliberately moving toward quieter positions, further from combat operations, deeper into the anonymous machinery of military logistics. She had requested transfers to remote bases, accepted demotions and responsibility, and never explained her reasons to anyone. Fort Draven had been the culmination of that, journey a logistics position at a training facility. as far from active operations as she could get while still serving. She had arrived 6 months ago with simple goals: do useful work, help people, and maintain the low profile that allowed her to keep her promise to Victor's memory. She hadn't expected the mockery, but she also didn't care about it. What were hurt feelings and damaged pride compared to the things she had seen and done in the SRR? What did it matter if Captain Vale thought she was incompetent, or if soldiers who had never faced real consequences made jokes about her abilities? Victor had taught her that true strength wasn't about proving yourself to people who didn't matter. It was about knowing who you were and acting accordingly when circumstances actually demanded it. Elena turned the photograph face down again and looked at the watch. Victor had left her a letter to be delivered after his death. She had read it only once on the day of his funeral and had never looked at it again. But she remembered every word. "My dearest Elena," it had begun, in his precise handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means I've finally pushed my luck too far. I've lived a long life and have no regrets about how I spent it. But I do have one request of you. Don't let my death trap you in the past. Don't let grief or guilt convince you that you need to prove something, or avenge something, or sacrifice yourself for some idea of honoring my memory. I didn't save you from that refugee camp just so you could spend your life punishing yourself. You're going to want to leave the reconnaissance work. I know that about you. You'll see my death as proof that this life takes too much, costs too much, requires too much sacrifice. And maybe you're right. Maybe it does. But here's what I want you to understand. There is honor and purpose in every form of service, from the most elite operations to the most basic support work. What matters isn't the glory of your position, but the integrity with which you fill it. If you choose to step back, to find quieter ways to serve, that's not weakness or failure. That's wisdom. But don't hide forever. Elena, don't bury who you are so completely that you forget you still have choices, still have agency, still have the capability to act when action is needed. You are not a weapon, my daughter. You are a protector. And protectors don't advertise themselves or seek recognition. They simply step forward when the moment demands it, do what needs to be done, and then step back into the quiet life they've chosen. Promise me this, when that moment comes, and it will come. Because life always tests us eventually, you'll act. Not for glory, not for recognition, not to prove anything to anyone. But because it's right, and because you have the capability to make a difference when others don't. That's all I ask. Live quietly if that brings you peace. But don't be so committed to your quiet life that you refuse to act when circumstances demand your skills. I love you, Elena. I'm proud of you. Not because of what you achieved in the SRR, but because of who you are, the girl who survived the unsurvivable and chose to become someone who protects others instead of someone who seeks revenge or wallows in victimhood. That's the legacy I hope to leave. Not my tactical victories or my medals, but you, a person who understands that true strength is measured in how you treat others when you have power over them, not in how much power you can accumulate. Be well, my daughter. Choose peace when you can, but choose action when you must. Always your father, Victor. Elena sat in her quiet quarters, touching the watch, remembering the letter, thinking about the promise she had made at Victor's grave. She had chosen peace. She had chosen quiet service. She had chosen to let go of the phantom and become simply Elena Kovač, logistics coordinator. But Victor's words echoed in her mind. Don't be so committed to your quiet life that you refuse to act when circumstances demand your skills. She hadn't faced such circumstances yet at Fort Draven. The mockery, the dismissal, the cruel nickname, none of that qualified as a moment that demanded action. Those were just the petty indignities of organizational politics. Uncomfortable but ultimately meaningless. But Elena could feel something building in the atmosphere of Fort Draven. Some tension that hadn't been there when she first arrived. Captain Vale's behavior was escalating, becoming more aggressive and less professional. The culture he was fostering was growing more toxic, more dismissive, more willing to cross lines that should remain uncrossed. She told herself it wasn't her concern. She told herself she had made a choice to leave that life behind. She told herself that intervening would compromise the peace she had fought so hard to establish. But deep down, in the part of her that Victor had trained and shaped, she knew the truth. If the moment came, if circumstances truly demanded action, she wouldn't be able to stay silent. The promise she had made to her father would require it. The question was whether Fort Draven would ever present such a moment, or whether she would be able to maintain her quiet existence indefinitely. Slowly fading into comfortable obscurity, the answer to that question was coming, tomorrow. In fact, Elena just didn't know it yet. The next morning began like any other at Fort Draven. The winter sun rose late over the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow-covered training grounds. Elena arrived at the logistics office at her usual time, 0545 hours, and began her daily routine of checking overnight supply requests, updating inventory databases, and coordinating equipment transfers. By 0800 hours, the base was fully operational. Soldiers moved through their morning formations, tactical units conducted briefings, and the mess hall served breakfast to personnel filtering in from various duty stations. The rhythm of military life continued with its predictable patterns and established hierarchies. At 0900 hours, Major Weston called Elena into his office with an unusual request. "Lieutenant Kovač, we have a situation," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Colonel Thorne has called a mandatory base-wide equipment certification exercise for this afternoon at 1400 hours. Every officer, regardless of their primary specialty, is required to participate." Elena kept her expression neutral. "What does the exercise entail, sir?" "It's a comprehensive evaluation of basic military competencies, weapons handling, tactical communications, field medicine, equipment maintenance, and physical fitness components. The idea is to ensure that even support personnel maintain fundamental military skills." Weston paused, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I know this isn't your normal area, but it's mandatory for all commissioned officers. No exceptions." "I understand, sir. Where should I report?" "The main training complex at 1345 hours. You'll be assigned to an evaluation group." Weston hesitated again. "Elena, I want you to know that I pushed back on this. I argued that logistics officers shouldn't be evaluated on the same standards as tactical personnel. But Colonel Thorne was insistent that everyone participate. It's not a problem. Major, I'll be there." What Elena didn't say, what she couldn't say without revealing things she had worked hard to keep hidden, was that this exercise represented exactly the kind of situation she had been trying to avoid. Participating would inevitably reveal capabilities that contradicted the carefully constructed image of a desk-bound administrator. Not participating would raise questions about why she was seeking exemptions. She was trapped between maintaining her anonymity and refusing a direct order. There was no good option. After leaving Weston's office, Elena returned to her quarters during the lunch hour. She stood before the small mirror, studying her reflection. The woman looking back was deliberately unremarkable regulation uniform, minimal bearing. The posture of someone who had spent years behind a desk rather than in the field. She thought about Victor's letter. "Don't be so committed to your quiet life that you refuse to act when circumstances demand your skills." This wasn't exactly what he had meant. This was a training exercise, not a crisis. But it was a moment that would force her capabilities into the open, whether she wanted that or not. She could perform poorly, deliberately failing to protect her cover. But that would mean dishonoring everything Victor had taught her about maintaining standards and performing with integrity regardless of circumstances, or she could perform honestly. and deal with whatever consequences emerged from people. Finally seeing who she actually was, the choice wasn't really a choice at all. Victor hadn't raised her to be someone who deliberately performed below her capabilities. That would be a different kind of hiding, a different kind of lie. At 13:45 hours, Elena reported to the main training complex. The large facility was crowded with officers from across the base, tactical personnel who attended these evaluations regularly, and support staff who looked varying degrees of uncomfortable about being pulled from their normal duties. Captain Marcus Vale was there, of course, along with his entire raider unit. He spotted Elena immediately, and his face lit up with anticipatory amusement. "Well, well," he announced loudly enough for the entire assembly area to hear. "Quartermaster Know Nothing has graced us with her presence. This should be entertaining." Several officers chuckled. Lieutenant Moss nudged Sergeant Reeves. "Think she can even hold a rifle properly?" 10 credits says she fails the basic marksmanship qualifier, another raider offered. "I'll take that bet," Reeves said quietly. Something in his tone suggested he wasn't as certain about Elena's incompetence as the others. But the betting continued anyway. Colonel Adriana Thorne entered the training bay with 3 other senior officers, all colonels, all veterans of extensive combat experience. Elena recognized 2 of them from their reputations alone. Colonel James Morrison, a former Special Forces commander with a legendary record in asymmetric warfare. Colonel Patricia Chun, who had led peacekeeping operations in 4 different conflict zones. And Colonel Samuel Rodriguez, an expert in advanced tactical training who had written several doctrinal manuals on small unit operations. The 4th colonel took Elena's breath away, Colonel David Rains. Tall, gray-haired, with the bearing of someone who had spent 40 years in uniform and earned every bit of authority he commanded. He had been Victor Kovač's closest friend and colleague for 3 decades. He had served alongside her father in the Kandarian conflict, the Solace operations, and countless other deployments. He had been at Victor's funeral, had delivered one of the eulogies, and had been one of the few people who knew about Victor's adopted daughter and her service in the SRR. Elena felt her pulse quicken. She hadn't known Rains was stationed at Fort Draven. She had deliberately avoided researching the senior leadership in detail, preferring to remain as anonymous and uninformed as possible. But here he was, one of 4 colonels who would be observing this exercise. Rains' eyes swept across the assembled officers. When his gaze reached Elena, there was the briefest pause, a fraction of a second where recognition flickered across his features before he schooled his expression back to professional neutrality. He knew who she was. The question was whether he would say anything. Colonel Thorne stepped forward to address the group. "Officers, thank you for your attendance. This certification exercise is designed to ensure that all commissioned personnel maintain fundamental military competencies regardless of their primary specialty. You'll be evaluated in 5 areas: weapons handling and marksmanship, tactical communications, field medicine, equipment maintenance, and a physical fitness assessment." She gestured to 4 evaluation stations set up throughout the training complex. "You'll rotate through each station in assigned groups. Evaluation criteria are pass-fail based on basic competency standards, not advanced performance. We're not expecting support personnel to perform at the level of specialized operators. We simply want to verify that everyone retains fundamental military skills." Vale leaned over to Moss and whispered, just loud enough for Elena to hear, "Basic competency standards. Perfect for Quartermaster Know Nothing. She might actually pass something designed for minimal expectations." Thorne continued, "You'll be divided into evaluation groups of 8. Group assignments are posted on the board. Report to your first station in 5 minutes." Elena checked the board and felt her stomach tighten. She was in Group 3, which included Captain Vale, Lieutenant Moss, and 2 other raiders. along with 3 support officers who looked as uncomfortable as Elena felt. The first station was weapons, handling, and marksmanship. They were escorted to an indoor range where the evaluation cadre had set up standardized firing positions with M4 carbines. The test was straightforward. Demonstrate safe weapons handling, engage targets at 50, 100, and 150 meters, and achieve minimum qualifying scores. Vale's group went first. As expected, the Raiders performed well-quick target acquisition, tight shot groups, confident handling. They were professionals who trained regularly with weapons. When Vale finished his sequence, scoring in the expert range, he made a show of holstering his weapon with exaggerated flair. "That's how it's done," he announced to no one in particular. The other support officers in the group went next. Their performance was adequate. They met the basic standards, but without the polish of regular tactical personnel. One lieutenant from the medical corps barely qualified, his hands shaking slightly from nerves. Then it was Elena's turn. She approached the firing line with the same quiet demeanor she brought to everything else. The range safety officer handed her the M4, and she accepted it with movements that were economical and practiced. She conducted a chamber check, verified the magazine was seated properly, and adjusted the sling with the kind of automatic muscle memory that comes from thousands of repetitions. Vale was watching with undisguised amusement. "Take your time, Quartermaster Know-Nothing. No pressure. Basic qualifying standards are pretty low. Even you should be able to." The first shot cracked across the range. Perfect center mass on the 50-meter target. Elena's stance had shifted the moment. She shouldered the weapon. The uncertain administrator disappeared, replaced by someone else entirely. Her breathing had slowed, her posture had locked into textbook firing position, and her grip on the weapon showed the confident control of someone intimately familiar with this tool. Second shot. Dead center on the 100-meter target. The joking commentary from Vale's section had stopped. Several officers were leaning forward, watching more carefully now. Third shot. Center mass on the 150-meter target. Elena continued through the qualification sequence with mechanical precision. Every shot was placed exactly where it needed to be. No wasted rounds, no misses, no hesitation. Her target transitions were smooth and efficient. Her trigger control was textbook perfect. Her follow-through showed the discipline of someone who had trained at levels far beyond basic qualification. When she finished, the range safety officer checked the electronic scoring system, and his eyebrows rose slightly. "Lieutenant Kovač. Perfect score. Expert qualification plus. Every round in the 9 or 10 ring." There was a moment of stunned silence. Sergeant Reeves, who had been watching closely, said quietly, "That's not support staff shooting. That's advanced tactical shooting." Elena cleared the weapon, verified the chamber was empty, and returned it to the safety officer with the same neutral expression she always wore. She didn't acknowledge the surprised stares, didn't react to the sudden shift in atmosphere, didn't explain or justify what everyone had just witnessed. She simply stepped back from the firing line and waited for the group to move to the next station. Vale's face had gone through several expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally settling on a kind of irritated suspicion. "You never mentioned you could shoot like that, Kovač." "You never asked, sir," Elena replied quietly. Colonel Rains, who had been observing from the elevated control booth, made a note on his evaluation tablet. His expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes held something that might have been recognition or possibly satisfaction. The second evaluation station was tactical communications. The officers were required to set up a field radio system, establish communications with a remote station, and troubleshoot a simulated equipment malfunction. The Raiders handled it competently, but not exceptionally. They knew the basics but weren't communication specialists. The support officers struggled more, fumbling with antenna configurations and frequency settings. When Elena's turn came, She assembled the radio system with the same practiced efficiency she had shown at the range. Her hands moved across the equipment without hesitation, connecting cables, configuring settings, establishing encryption protocols. When the simulated malfunction was introduced, she diagnosed it in under 30 seconds and implemented the correct solution without referring to any technical manuals. The communications evaluator, a captain from the Signals Corps, looked at her assessment and then at Elena with undisguised surprise. "Lieutenant, your response time and diagnostic accuracy are consistent with senior communications specialists. That's not typical for logistics personnel. I've worked extensively with communications equipment in my previous assignment, sir," Elena said, which was technically true while revealing nothing specific. The third station was field medicine. Officers were required to demonstrate basic trauma care, including wound management, airway control, and casualty evacuation procedures. Again, Elena performed with the kind of automatic competence that suggested far more experience than her official record indicated. Her hands moved with surgical precision. Her assessment process was systematic and thorough, and her treatment protocols showed advanced tactical combat casualty care training that most support personnel would never receive. By the fourth station, equipment maintenance word had begun to spread through the training complex. Officers from other evaluation groups were finding reasons to observe. Group 3, the quiet logistics officer who everyone had dismissed for 6 months, was systematically demonstrating capabilities that didn't match her position or reputation. Captain Vale's amusement had completely evaporated, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like embarrassment mixed with growing anger. He had spent months mocking someone who was now proving to be more capable than most of his own unit. The final station was the physical fitness assessment, a timed circuit that included obstacles, carrying equipment, and demonstrating basic combat movement techniques. Elena completed it with the same quiet efficiency, finishing in the top 10% of all participants, moving with the fluid athleticism of someone who maintained serious physical conditioning, despite having no official reason to do so. When Group 3's evaluations were complete, the officers were dismissed back to their regular duties. Most left quickly, eager to return to familiar environments and process what they had just witnessed. The raiders departed in a tight group, their usual bravado notably absent. Elena was gathering her gear when Colonel Rains approached. "Lieutenant Kovač," he said formally, "a word in private, please." Elena felt her heart rate increase, but kept her expression neutral. "Yes, sir." They walked to a small office adjacent to the training bay. Rains closed the door and turned to face her. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and Elena saw emotions flickering across his face: grief, recognition, something that might have been approval or possibly concern. "Phantom," he said quietly, using her old call sign from the SRR. "That's not my name anymore, sir," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt at hearing that designation after 3 years. "No," Rains agreed. "I suppose it isn't. But the question is, Elena, why are you here, hiding in a logistics office, pretending to be something you're not?" "I'm not pretending to be anything, Colonel. I'm doing my job." "You're doing far less than your job," Rains said, but his tone wasn't accusatory. It was curious, almost gentle. "You're one of the most capable officers I've ever encountered, and you're processing supply requisitions at a training base in the middle of nowhere. Victor wouldn't have wanted this for you." At the mention of her father's name, Elena's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "With respect, sir, you don't know what he would have wanted." "Actually, I do." Rains pulled a sealed envelope from his pocket. "Victor gave this to me 6 months before he died. He asked me to deliver it to you if I ever found you serving somewhere below your capabilities. He said you would try to disappear after he was gone, and that someone would need to remind you of your actual purpose." Elena stared at the envelope, her father's handwriting clearly visible on the front. "For Elena, when she's ready." "I'm not ready," she whispered. "I don't think Victor meant for you to be ready," Rains said gently. "I think he meant for you to act anyway." Before Elena could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway outside, raised voices, the sound of a confrontation. Rains opened the door to investigate, and Elena followed. What they found would change everything. The moment had arrived, though neither of them knew it yet. The quiet life Elena had carefully constructed was about to shatter completely. And the promise she had made to Victor, to act when circumstances demanded, was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. The commotion was coming from the main corridor that connected the training complex to the administrative wing. As Elena and Colonel Rains moved toward the source of the disturbance, the raised voices became clearer, one male, aggressive and angry, the other female. Controlled but strained. They rounded the corner to find a scene that made Elena's blood run cold. Captain Marcus Vale had Private First Class Sarah Chun backed against the wall. Chun was the young communications specialist who had witnessed Elena fix the jammed locker weeks ago. Quiet, competent, barely 22 years old, she was holding a tablet against her chest defensively, and her face showed a mixture of fear and determination. "I don't care what the regulations say," Vale was saying, his voice sharp with anger. "You don't send corrective memorandums about my unit's equipment handling without running them through me first. Who the hell do you think you are?" "Sir, the memorandum was required by the communications protocols," Chun replied, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. "When equipment is returned damaged or improperly configured, documentation is mandatory. I was following proper procedures. You were embarrassing my unit by implying we don't know how to handle our gear." Vale interrupted, stepping closer. His body language was aggressive, deliberately using his physical presence to intimidate. "You're a junior enlisted communications tech. You don't have the authority to criticize how officers run their operations." Several other personnel had stopped in the hallway, watching the confrontation but not intervening. The unwritten rules of military hierarchy were clear. A captain confronting a private was an asymmetric power dynamic that junior personnel didn't interfere with unless things crossed clear lines. But those lines were about to be crossed. "Sir, I wasn't criticizing," Chun started to say. "Don't interrupt me when I'm speaking," Vale snapped. "You need to learn your place in this organization, Private. You think because you can file paperwork and send official-sounding memos that you have some kind of authority? You're nothing. You're a junior tech who got lucky enough to get assigned to a real military base instead of washing out like you probably should have." Chun's face flushed with humiliation. Her hands were shaking now, though whether from fear or anger was difficult to tell. "Captain Vale, I apologize if the memorandum came across as inappropriate, but the damage to the communications equipment was significant," and Vale's hand shot out, and he grabbed the tablet from Chun's grasp. "This?" He held it up. "This is what you're making a federal case about? Some scratched equipment and a loose connection? Sir, that equipment is worth $15,000, and the damage could have been prevented with proper handling. Are you calling me incompetent?" Vale's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "No, sir. I'm just stating that. You're just stating that you think you know better than a combat officer with 6 years of tactical experience. You think your 2 years of technical school makes you qualified to judge how we operate." "Colonel." Rains was already moving forward, his command voice activating. "Captain Vale, step back from that private, now." Vale turned, saw the colonel, and his expression shifted immediately to something more controlled. But he didn't step back. "Sir, this is a unit discipline matter. Private Chun violated protocol by sending official documentation without proper authorization. And you're violating about 5 different regulations by confronting a junior enlisted personnel in this manner." Rains replied coldly, "Release that equipment and step back." "That's an order." For a moment, Vale seemed to consider defying the order. Then he thrust the tablet back at Chun with enough force that she fumbled to catch it. This conversation isn't over, Private. Report to my office at 0800 tomorrow. Negative, Rain said flatly. Private Chun reports to her chain of command, which doesn't include you. You have no authority to summon her to your office for any reason. Is that clear, Captain? Vale's jaw tightened. Crystal clear, sir. Good. Now return to your duties. Vale straightened, offered a crisp but resentful salute, and turned to leave. As he passed Elena, who had been standing silently beside Rains throughout the exchange, his eyes locked on hers. For just a moment, she saw something ugly in his expression, a kind of resentment that had been building for months and was now looking for a target. Must be nice, Vale said, his voice low but clearly audible, having colonels step in to protect incompetent personnel. Maybe Quartermaster Know-Nothing here can teach you how to hide behind rank, Chun. The implication was clear. Vale was lumping Chun together with Elena, suggesting both were weak, protected by higher authority rather than earning respect through competence. It was a petty, vicious little comment designed to humiliate both women while maintaining plausible deniability. Rains opened his mouth to respond, but Elena spoke first, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the corridor. Captain Vale. He turned back, surprised that Elena was addressing him directly. In 6 months, she had barely spoken unless directly asked a question. Her voice always stayed neutral, professional, forgettable. But something was different now. Elena's posture had shifted, subtly still at ease, but with a kind of coiled readiness that hadn't been visible before. Her hazel eyes, which usually stayed carefully neutral, were fixed on Vale with an intensity that made several observers unconsciously step back. Private Chun was following proper protocol in documenting equipment damage, Elena said, her voice still quiet but with an edge of absolute certainty. The regulations are clear. Technical personnel are required to file incident reports when issued equipment is returned in degraded condition. She wasn't criticizing your unit's competence. She was doing her job correctly. Vale's face flushed. Nobody asked for your input, Kovač. This doesn't concern you. Actually, it does, Elena replied. Supply and communications coordination fall under logistics oversight. Equipment damage documentation crosses my desk. Private Chun's memorandum was appropriate, accurate, and professionally written. Your response to it was none of those things. The corridor had gone very quiet. Officers and enlisted personnel who had been passing through had stopped to watch this unprecedented moment. The quiet logistics officer was directly challenging a tactical unit commander. In the rigid social hierarchy of Fort Draven, this simply didn't happen. Vale took a step toward Elena, his expression darkening. You're really going to lecture me on professionalism? You, who everyone knows is only here because you couldn't hack it in any real military role? I'm not lecturing you on anything, sir, Elena said, her voice remaining level despite the provocation. I'm stating facts about protocols and regulations. If you have a problem with Private Chun's memorandum, there are proper channels for addressing it. Confronting her in a hallway and attempting to intimidate her isn't one of them. Intimidate? Vale's voice rose. I was having a conversation with a member of my operational support team. Private Chun is not part of your operational support team, Elena interrupted. She's assigned to the base communications section and reports through an entirely different chain of command. You have no authority over her assignments, her performance reviews, or her professional conduct. The fact that you attempted to summon her to your office suggests either ignorance of basic command structure or deliberate abuse of your position. The watching personnel exchanged shocked glances. No one had ever heard Elena speak this many words consecutively, let alone use them to systematically dismantle a captain's argument in front of witnesses. Vale's face had gone from flushed to nearly purple. You forget yourself, Lieutenant. Just because you managed to shoot well in a qualification exercise doesn't mean you suddenly have the authority to question how senior officers conduct business. I'm not questioning how senior officers conduct business, Elena replied. I'm questioning how you conduct business. There's a difference. The insult was subtle but unmistakable. By specifying you rather than senior officers in general, Elena was implying that Vale's behavior was individual misconduct rather than standard practice, that he was the problem, not the system. Vale closed the distance between them in 2 quick steps, now standing less than a foot from Elena. His physical size advantage was obvious. He had at least 6 inches and 50 pounds on her. The body language was deliberately threatening, using physical presence to intimidate. You need to learn to keep your mouth shut, Kovač, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You may have fooled some people today with your little performance, but I know what you really are. You're a desk officer who's been hiding behind paperwork because you don't have what it takes for real military service. And now you're trying to pretend you have some kind of moral authority? You're pathetic. Elena didn't move, didn't step back, didn't show any reaction to Vale being in her personal space. She simply looked at him with those hazel eyes that had suddenly gone very cold and very hard. Are you threatening me, Captain? She asked quietly. I'm giving you professional advice, Vale replied. Stay in your lane. Do your inventory counts. Process your requisitions. And stop pretending you have any relevance beyond that. Step back. Captain, Colonel Rains ordered, his voice cutting through the tension. You're dangerously close to charges of conduct unbecoming an officer. But Vale was beyond caring about consequences now. 6 months of having his mockery validated by an entire base culture had convinced him he was untouchable. 6 months of Elena accepting his insults without response had convinced him she was weak. And the last hour of watching her demonstrate capabilities that contradicted everything he'd believed about her had left him feeling humiliated and desperate to reassert dominance. Or what? Vale said, still staring at Elena, You'll file a complaint? Everyone will believe that Quartermaster Know-Nothing suddenly decided to grow a spine after 6 months of taking everything everyone dished out. Captain Vale, that is enough, Rains said, stepping forward now. You are relieved from duty as of this moment. Report to Colonel Thorne's office. Vale's hand moved out. It happened fast as sudden. Angry motion born from frustration and humiliation and 6 months of unchecked arrogance. His palm connected with Elena's face in an open-handed slap that cracked through the corridor like a gunshot. The sound echoed in the sudden absolute silence that followed. Elena's head had snapped to the side from the impact. A red mark was already forming on her cheek, but she didn't stagger, didn't step back, didn't raise her hands to her face. She slowly turned her head back to face Vale, and something in her eyes made him take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't anger, it wasn't rage. It was something far colder and more dangerous, the look of someone who had just watched a line get crossed that could never be uncrossed. The look of someone who had been holding back something powerful and had just been given justification to release it. You made a mistake, Elena said quietly, her voice carrying a weight it hadn't held before. Not a threat, just a simple statement of fact. Colonel Rains' voice cut through the frozen moment like a blade. Captain Marcus Vale, you are under arrest for assault on a commissioned officer. You will be confined to quarters pending court-martial proceedings. But before anyone could move, 3 more figures appeared at the end of the corridor. Colonels Thorne, Morrison, and Chun had been conducting inspections in the administrative wing and had been drawn by the commotion. They had seen everything. Colonel Thorne's face was a mask of fury as she took in the scene. Vale standing too close to Elena. The red mark on Elena's face, the shocked witnesses lining the corridor, and the palpable tension in the air. Someone, Thorne said, her voice deadly quiet, had better explain to me what just happened here. And it had better be the truth, because I guarantee you that every security camera in this corridor captured whatever occurred. Vale's face went white as he realized the implications. In his anger and humiliation, he had assaulted a fellow officer in a corridor with full video surveillance and dozens of witnesses. There would be no way to spin this, no way to minimize it, no way to avoid consequences. Sergeant Reeves, who had been among the witnesses, stepped forward. His voice was formal and precise. "Ma'am, I witnessed Captain Vale physically strike Lieutenant Kovač, without provocation, following a verbal altercation regarding proper protocols for equipment damage documentation." Other voices joined in, confirming the account. Private Chun, despite her fear of Vale, spoke clearly. "Captain Vale slapped Lieutenant Kovač, ma'am. She didn't do anything to provoke it. She was just explaining the regulations." Colonel Thorne's gaze swept across the assembled witnesses, then settled on Vale with an expression of absolute contempt. "Captain Vale, you are relieved of command effective immediately. Military police will escort you to confinement. You will remain there until your court-martial, which I will personally ensure happens as quickly as regulations allow." She turned to her fellow colonels. "Gentlemen, I believe we need to have a very serious conversation about command climate and leadership accountability at this installation." Then she looked at Elena, and her expression shifted to something more complex: concern, curiosity, and perhaps recognition that there was more to this story than had been immediately apparent. "Lieutenant Kovač, you're coming with us. We need your full statement, and I suspect we need to have a much longer conversation about who you actually are and what you're doing at my base." Elena touched the mark on her face briefly, then straightened to attention. Her voice when she spoke was the voice of someone who had just stepped out of one identity and was preparing to reveal another. "Yes, ma'am. I think that conversation is long overdue." The transformation had begun. The moment Victor had written about in his letter had arrived, and Elena Kovač, Phantom of the Specialized Reconnaissance Regiment, was done hiding. The conference room on the third floor of Fort Draven's headquarters building was designed for senior leadership meetings. A large, rectangular table surrounded by high-backed chairs, secure communications equipment built into the walls, and soundproofing that ensured complete privacy. The room had hosted countless briefings, strategic planning sessions, and difficult conversations over the years, but the conversation that was about to happen would be unlike any that had occurred there before. Elena sat in one of the chairs, her posture erect but not rigid, her hands folded calmly on the table in front of her. The red mark on her face had darkened to a visible bruise, a stark physical reminder of what had just occurred in the corridor below. Medical personnel had offered to examine and document the injury, but Elena had declined. It was superficial, painful but not serious, and there were more important matters to address. The four colonels entered together: Thorne, Rains, Morrison, and Chun. They took seats across from Elena, their expressions ranging from Thorne's controlled fury to Rains' complicated mixture of concern and something that might have been vindication. Colonel Thorne spoke first, her voice formal and precise. "Lieutenant Kovač, before we begin, I want to be absolutely clear about something. What Captain Vale did was unacceptable, criminal, and a complete violation of every standard we hold as military officers. You have my personal assurance that he will face the fullest consequences that military justice allows. His behavior does not reflect the values of this installation or the Valyrian Republic's armed forces." "Thank you, ma'am," Elena replied quietly. "That being said," Thorne continued, "we need to understand what happened in that corridor. And more importantly, we need to understand who you are. Because the officer I watched qualify expert on the weapons range today, who demonstrated advanced tactical communications knowledge, and who just stood her ground against an aggressive superior officer without flinching, that person doesn't match the personnel File of a logistics coordinator who spent the last 3 years in administrative positions. Elena had known this moment would come eventually. She had hoped to avoid it indefinitely, to maintain her quiet anonymity and serve out her remaining years in peaceful obscurity. But Vale's hand had forced the issue, and Victor's words echoed in her mind. When that moment comes, you'll act. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because it's right. This was her moment. Not the moment to act in the dramatic sense, but the moment to finally be honest about who she was and why she had been hiding. "Ma'am, my personnel file is accurate as far as it goes," Elena began, her voice steady. "I have been serving in logistics positions for the past 3 years. Before that, I held other administrative and support roles. All of that is documented correctly. But it's not complete, is it?" Colonel Morrison interjected. He was a lean man with sharp features and the kind of analytical gaze that suggested he missed very little. "Your file shows standard career progression for a support officer, but there are gaps. Periods where your assignment location is listed simply as deployed, with no specifics. Training certifications that aren't typical for logistics personnel. And most tellingly, performance reviews that consistently use phrases like maintains appropriate discretion and handles sensitive assignments with professionalism language. That suggests there's information that isn't being included in the standard documentation." Elena met Morrison's gaze directly. He was right, of course. Her file had been carefully sanitized when she left the SRR, removing classified operational details while maintaining technical accuracy. Anyone who knew what to look for would recognize the patterns of omission. Colonel Rains spoke up, his voice gentler than the others. "Elena, these officers need to understand your background. Not because you're in trouble, you're not, but because what happened today requires context. And because we need to address some serious command climate issues that have apparently been festering at this installation for months." Elena looked at Rains, saw the understanding in his eyes, and made her decision. Victor had wanted her to live quietly if that brought peace, but also to be honest when circumstances demanded it. These circumstances demanded it. "My name is Elena Kovač," she began. "I was adopted at 17 by Colonel Victor Kovač after he found me in a refugee camp during the Kandarian peacekeeping operations. Some of you may have known him." All 4 colonels reacted to the name. Thorne's eyes widened slightly. Morrison sat back in his chair. Chun nodded slowly with recognition. Rain's expression confirmed what the others were beginning to realize. This wasn't just about a logistics officer with hidden skills. This was about legacy. "Victor Kovač," Thorne said quietly. "The tactical genius from the Kandarian campaigns. I read his operational doctrine papers when I was at command college. He was legendary. Doesn't even begin to cover it." "Yes, ma'am," Elena confirmed. "He was my father in every way that mattered. He trained me from the time I was 17 until I enlisted at 20. Not because he wanted me to follow in his footsteps, but because he believed that capability should be paired with discipline, skill should be paired with judgment, and strength should be paired with the wisdom to use it correctly." She paused, organizing her thoughts. This was the first time in 3 years she had spoken about this to anyone outside of the handful of people who already knew. "After my basic training, I was recruited into the Specialized Reconnaissance Regiment. I served there for 8 years, conducting operations in denied territory, gathering intelligence, and supporting special operations task forces. My call sign was Phantom." Elena's voice remained steady, but saying that name aloud after so long felt strange, like invoking someone who had died. "I was good at it. Very good. I received commendations, promotions, and was eventually leading my own reconnaissance teams." Colonel Chun leaned forward, her expression intent. "The SRR doesn't recruit from standard military personnel. Their selection process is brutal. Less than 5% of candidates make it through. And you led teams? Yes, ma'am. For the last 2 years of my service there. So what happened? Morrison asked. Why are you processing supply requisitions at a training base instead of conducting reconnaissance operations? Elena's hands tightened briefly on the table, the only visible sign of the emotion beneath her controlled exterior. My father was killed 3 years ago during the Solis compound attack. He died holding a defensive position so that others could evacuate. When I got the news, I was in the Morton Highlands conducting a surveillance operation. They extracted me for the funeral, and I realized that I had spent 8 years doing important work thousands of miles away, while the people I loved died without me there. The room was completely silent now. The 4 colonels listening with the kind of focused attention that suggested they understood the weight of what Elena was describing. I decided I didn't want to do that work anymore, Elena continued. Not because I couldn't, or because it wasn't important, but because I needed something different. My father had told me once that there are many ways to serve, and that the most valuable thing you can do is sometimes just be present for people who need you. So I requested a transfer out of the SRR. It took 6 months to process. They tried very hard to convince me to stay, but eventually I was reassigned to support positions. And you've been deliberately serving below your capability ever since, Thorne said. But there was no judgment in her voice, just understanding. I've been serving in the way I chose to serve, ma'am. Processing requisitions, coordinating supplies, helping people get what they need. That work matters too. It's not glamorous and it doesn't come with recognition, but it's useful and it allows me to maintain the kind of life I wanted after ... After everything. Colonel Rains pulled out the sealed envelope he had shown Elena earlier, her father's letter. He placed it on the table between them. Victor gave me this before he died. He told me that if I ever found you serving somewhere below your capabilities, I should give it to you. He said you would try to disappear after he was gone. Elena looked at the envelope with her name written in Victor's familiar handwriting. He understood me well. He also understood that sometimes hiding isn't the same as healing, Rain said gently. And that choosing peace doesn't mean accepting abuse. Captain Vale's behavior, Thorne interjected, her voice hardening again, was completely unacceptable regardless of your background. But the fact that it occurred in an environment where apparently an entire base was complicit in mocking and dismissing a highly qualified officer makes this a systemic problem. That goes far beyond one captain's criminal assault. She looked at the other colonels. Gentlemen, we have a command climate crisis at Fort Draven. An elite operator with 8 years of reconnaissance experience has been serving here for 6 months. And not only did no one recognize her capabilities, but the entire installation apparently thought it was acceptable to mock her daily. That tells me we have serious problems with how we value different types of service and how we treat personnel in support roles. Morrison nodded grimly. The Quartermaster Know-Nothing nickname. I heard it being used. I thought it was just typical barracks humor. I didn't realize it was sustained harassment targeting a specific individual. Most people didn't realize it, Elena said quietly. And honestly, ma'am, sirs, I didn't object because I was trying to maintain a low profile. I wasn't looking for recognition or respect. I just wanted to do my job quietly and be left alone. You shouldn't have to accept mockery and harassment in order to be left alone, Chun said firmly. That's not how professional military organizations are supposed to function. The fact that Captain Vale felt comfortable escalating from verbal harassment to physical assault suggests he believed the environment would protect him. That's on us as senior leadership. We failed to maintain appropriate standards. Thorne stood and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds below. Snow was falling again, covering Fort Draven in fresh white silence. When she spoke, her voice was measured but carried absolute authority. Here's what's going to happen. Captain Vale will face court-martial for assault on a commissioned officer. The evidence is overwhelming, and there will be no plea bargain. He's done in this military. She turned back to face the room. But we also need to address the broader cultural issues. I'm ordering a complete command climate review of Fort Draven. Every unit, every leader, every policy that allowed this environment to develop. And Lieutenant Kovač, whether you want it or not, you're going to be central to that review, because your experience here illuminates problems we've been blind to. Elena felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. This was exactly what she had been trying to avoid, becoming the center of attention, having her past examined, being held up as an example. Ma'am, I'd prefer to just return to my duties and continue processing requisitions while people whisper about what happened. Thorn interrupted, not unkindly. Elena, that option is gone. Everyone on this base saw or will hear about what happened today. Your performance in the certification exercise is already spreading through the installation. Your confrontation with Vale is probably being discussed in every barracks and office right now. You can't go back to being invisible. But I don't want to go back to reconnaissance work, Elena said, and there was an edge of desperation in her voice now. I made a choice. I left that life for good reasons. No one is asking you to go back to the SRR, Rains assured her. But we are asking you to acknowledge your actual capabilities and perhaps consider how those capabilities might be used in ways that align with your current choices. Colonel Morrison leaned forward. Lieutenant Kovač, what if there was a way to serve that honored both your skills and your desire for a different kind of life? What if instead of hiding your experience, you used it to teach others? To improve how we train personnel, how we develop leaders, how we integrate different specialties. Elena looked at him, uncertain where this was leading. Sir? Fort Draven is a training installation, Morrison explained. We develop tactical units, yes, but we also develop leaders, support personnel, and integrated teams. What if your role here wasn't just processing supplies, but helping us build a culture where people like Private Chun aren't intimidated by people like Captain Vale, where support personnel are valued appropriately, where the lessons you learned in the SRR could be shared in ways that make everyone better? It was an appealing idea, but Elena was wary of anything that might pull her back toward the intensity and pressure of her old life. I'm not interested in being a public figure or a spokesperson, sir. We're not asking you to be, Thorne said, returning to her seat. We're asking you to stop hiding and start contributing at your actual level. Not as a reconnaissance operator, but as an experienced officer with valuable knowledge and perspective. There's a middle ground between being Phantom of the SRR and being an invisible logistics coordinator that everyone mocks. You can serve meaningfully without returning to the life you left behind. Elena sat silently, processing this. Victor's letter sat on the table between them, still sealed. She thought about his words from the letter she had read at his funeral. There is honor and purpose in every form of service. What matters isn't the glory of your position, but the integrity with which you fill it. Had she been serving with integrity? Or had she been hiding behind a false humility, doing good work, but refusing to acknowledge or share the depth of her actual experience? I need time to think about this, ma'am, Elena finally said. Thorne nodded. You have it. Take the rest of the week off. That mark on your face will heal, but the psychological impact of what Vale did might take longer. Talk to a counselor if you need to. Read your father's letter. Figure out what you actually want from your service, not just what you're running away from. Yes, ma'am, but Elena, Thorne added, her voice softening slightly, understand that change is coming whether you want it or not. What happened today can't be undone. The question isn't whether your life at Fort Draven will be different. It will be. The question is whether you'll be an active participant in shaping that difference or a passive recipient of it. Elena stood, came to attention, and saluted. The 4 colonels returned the salute, and Rains walked her to the door. "Read Victor's letter," he said quietly as she was leaving. "He knew you better than anyone. Trust that he understood what you'd need to hear when this moment came." Elena nodded and left the conference room, walking through the headquarters building toward her quarters. Personnel she passed stared at her, some with curiosity, some with newfound respect, some simply uncertain how to react to the revelation that the quiet logistics officer was something else entirely. By the time she reached her quarters, word had spread throughout the entire base. Phantom was at Fort Draven. The legendary reconnaissance operator, who everyone thought had died or disappeared years ago, had been processing their supply requisitions and accepting their mockery for 6 months. Elena closed her door, sat at her small desk, and picked up the sealed envelope containing her father's final message. Her hands shook slightly as she broke the seal. Whatever Victor had written would shape whatever came next. Because Colonel Thorne was right, there was no going back to invisibility now. The only path forward was through truth. Even if that truth was uncomfortable. Elena unfolded the letter and began to read words her father had written specifically for this moment. Knowing with the prescience of someone who understood his daughter completely that this day would eventually arrive. Letter was written on Victor's personal stationery, simple, cream-colored paper with his name and rank embossed at the top. His handwriting was precise and measured, the penmanship of someone who had spent decades writing operational orders and strategic assessments. Elena's hand steadied as she began to read. "My dearest Elena, if you're reading this second letter, it means David Rains found you serving somewhere far below your capabilities, and you're now facing a choice about who you want to be going forward. I'm glad. Not because I want you to be uncomfortable, but because I know that true growth only happens when we're forced to confront the gaps between who we are and who we're pretending to be. By now, you've spent several years in quiet service. You've probably convinced yourself that this is penance for not being there when I died. Or perhaps you believe that stepping away from reconnaissance work honors some promise you think you made to me. Let me be clear, my daughter. You made no such promise, and I require no such penance. I died doing exactly what I chose to do, protecting people who needed protecting. I have no regrets about that choice, and I don't want you to carry guilt for being exactly where you were supposed to be when it happened. You were conducting important operations in the Highlands. You were doing your job with excellence. My death doesn't diminish the value of that work, and it shouldn't define your future. I also understand why you left the SRR, that life takes pieces of your soul with every mission. And there comes a point where you have to decide if the cost is worth the purpose. You decided it wasn't, and that's a valid choice. I'm proud of you for recognizing your limits and honoring them. However, and this is important, choosing to step away from elite operations doesn't mean choosing to hide who you actually are. There's a difference between seeking peace and seeking invisibility. Peace comes from finding work that aligns with your values while using your capabilities appropriately. Invisibility comes from fear of being seen. I suspect you've been invisible for a while now. You've probably been doing good work in whatever position you're filling, but you've been doing it while carefully hiding the depth of your training, the extent of your experience, and the true scope of your capabilities. You've been serving below yourself, and I imagine you've told yourself that this is noble humility. It's not. It's fear wearing humility's clothing. Elena, the world doesn't need you to be less than you are. It needs you to be exactly who you are, using your gifts appropriately in whatever context you choose. If you want to work in logistics at your actual level. Use your strategic thinking, your organizational skills, your understanding of complex systems. If you want to teach with the full depth of your experience. If you want to support rather than lead operations, support them with excellence that reflects your training. But stop pretending to be incompetent. Stop accepting treatment that dishonors your service. Stop hiding behind a false modesty that serves no one. Least of all yourself. I imagine something happened that forced this confrontation. Perhaps someone finally pushed you too far. Or maybe circumstances required you to demonstrate capabilities you've been concealing. Whatever happened, you're now facing a choice. Retreat further into invisibility, or step forward into authentic service. I can't make that choice for you. But I can tell you what I believe. You have gifts that were developed through tremendous sacrifice, training, and experience. Those gifts don't obligate you to serve in elite units or conduct dangerous operations. But they do obligate you to serve honestly, using those gifts appropriately rather than burying them. There's a concept I learned late in my career, and I wish I'd understood it earlier: the zone of optimal contribution. It's the place where your capabilities, your values, and the world's needs intersect. For some people, that zone is in elite tactical operations. For others, it's in support roles, teaching positions, or strategic planning. The key is finding where you can contribute most authentically while maintaining the kind of life you actually want. I don't think you've found that zone yet. Elena, I think you've been serving in positions that use only a fraction of your capabilities because you're afraid that using more would pull you back into the life you left. But that's a false choice. You can use your full range of skills without returning to reconnaissance operations. You can contribute at your actual level without sacrificing the peace you've worked to establish. What you can't do, or at least what you shouldn't do, is continue hiding. Because hiding doesn't just diminish you. It diminishes everyone around you. People who could learn from your experience don't get that opportunity. Organizations that could benefit from your insights don't receive them. And you slowly erode your own sense of purpose and value. So here's my challenge to you, my daughter. Stop hiding. Not by returning to the SRR or taking on missions you don't want, but by acknowledging who you actually are and finding ways to contribute that honor both your capabilities and your current values. Maybe that means teaching tactical thinking to support personnel who are dismissed as non-combat, but actually need sophisticated skills. Maybe it means using your organizational brilliance to redesign how military logistics actually function. Maybe it means mentoring young officers who show promise but lack guidance. I don't know what your optimal contribution zone looks like, but I know it's not processing basic requisitions while pretending you don't have strategic level expertise. You're afraid that being seen will trap you. But actually, being invisible is what's trapping you. It's keeping you in positions below your capability, accepting treatment below your dignity, and living below your purpose. I want more for you than that. There's a memorial ceremony held every year at the Kandarian Peace Gardens, the place where I first found you 17 years ago. They honor people who survived the Civil War and went on to contribute meaningfully to society. Every year, they tell stories of refugees who became doctors, teachers, engineers, leaders. People who took their trauma and transformed it into purpose. Your story belongs there, Elena. Not because you survived the camp, though that took tremendous strength, but because you took that survival and built something meaningful from it. You became someone who protects others, who serves with excellence, who carries tremendous capability with appropriate humility. But the ceremony isn't for people who hide their stories. It's for people who acknowledge their journeys and let others learn from them. Your hiding doesn't just diminish you. It denies others the inspiration of seeing what's possible when someone transforms pain into purpose. I'm not asking you to become a public figure or a celebrity. I'm asking you to stop pretending to be less than you are. When David Rains gives you this letter, he'll probably also offer you some kind of opportunity, a position, a role, a chance to contribute differently. Whatever he offers, consider it seriously. David is one of the best strategic minds I've ever known. And he wouldn't offer you something unless he believed it would honor both your capabilities and your choices, but more than any specific opportunity. I want you to internalize this truth. You can serve meaningfully without sacrificing your peace. You can use your full capabilities without returning to the life you left. You can be seen without being consumed. The Elena who survived the refugee camp was invisible, because she had to be. Visibility meant danger. The Elena who served in the SRR was highly visible to a select few, but invisible to everyone else. That was operational security. But the Elena who exists now, you don't need to be invisible anymore. You're not in danger, and you're not conducting classified operations. You're simply a highly capable officer who has chosen support work. There's no reason to hide that combination. In fact, that combination might be exactly what the military needs: people who understand elite operations, but choose to serve differently. So stop hiding. My daughter, step forward. Find your zone of optimal contribution. Use your gifts appropriately. Accept the recognition and respect that your capabilities deserve, while maintaining the boundaries that your values require. You can do both. I promise you can do both. One final thought. You've been carrying my watch since I died. Every time you touch it, you're probably remembering me and feeling the weight of my legacy. I want you to start thinking of that watch differently. It's not a burden. It's not a reminder of what you lost or what you're supposed to live up to. It's simply a tool that measures time, the time you have remaining to make whatever contribution feels authentic to you. I gave you that watch not so you'd think of me constantly, but so you'd remember that time is limited and precious. You've already spent 3 years in positions that don't challenge you. How many more years will you spend there before you decide to serve at your actual level? Time is passing, Elena. Use it well. Not by doing what you think I would want, but by doing what actually aligns with who you are and who you want to become. I love you. I'm proud of you. And I believe in your ability to find meaningful service that honors both your capabilities and your choices. Choose wisely. But more importantly, choose honestly. Always your father, Victor. Elena read the letter 3 times, slowly, letting each word settle into her consciousness. Victor's voice came through clearly in every sentence, direct, challenging, loving, and completely devoid of sentimentality or manipulation. He wasn't telling her what to do. He was telling her what was at stake in the choice she faced. She set the letter down and looked at the chronograph watch on her wrist. For 3 years, she had touched it as a reminder of her father, a connection to someone she'd lost. But Victor was right. It had become a burden, a constant reminder of legacy and loss rather than a simple tool for measuring time. How much time had she spent hiding? How many opportunities to contribute meaningfully had she avoided because she was afraid that visibility would trap her? Elena stood and walked to the small mirror mounted on her quarters wall. The bruise on her face was vivid now, a purple mark that would take days to fade. But it was also evidence. Evidence that her hiding had ended not because she chose to emerge, but because someone else's violence had forced the issue. What if she had stepped forward months ago? What if she had acknowledged her capabilities and contributed at her actual level from the beginning? Would Captain Vale still have escalated to physical assault, or would an environment that properly valued all forms of service have prevented his behavior from reaching that point? She couldn't know the answer to that question, but she could control what happened next. Elena returned to her desk and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. She began writing, organizing her thoughts about what Victor had challenged her to consider. What was her zone of optimal contribution? What work would use her capabilities appropriately while maintaining the kind of life she actually wanted? After an hour of reflection and writing, a picture began to emerge. She didn't want to return to reconnaissance operations. That decision remained firm. But she also didn't want to continue processing basic requisitions, while hiding the strategic and tactical expertise she had developed over 17 years of training and service. What she wanted was something in between. Work that used her organizational and strategic thinking. That contributed meaningfully to mission success. But that kept her away from direct combat operations, and the psychological toll they exacted. Fort Draven was a training installation. It prepared tactical units for deployment, but it also trained support personnel, developed leaders, and tried to integrate different specialties into cohesive teams. There was meaningful work to be done in improving how that training happened, making it more realistic, more integrated, more respectful of different roles. That work would use her reconnaissance experience, her understanding of how operations actually functioned, and her organizational skills. But it wouldn't require her to conduct dangerous missions or make the kind of life or death decisions that had eventually become unbearable. It would also give her the opportunity to address the kind of toxic culture that had allowed someone like Captain Vale to flourish, to teach young officers that strength comes in many forms, that support roles require sophisticated skills, and that true leadership means valuing every type of contribution. Elena picked up Victor's letter and read the final paragraph again. Choose wisely. But more importantly, choose honestly. She had been choosing dishonestly for 3 years, hiding, minimizing herself, pretending to be less capable than she was. That needed to end. Not by returning to her old life, but by acknowledging her actual capabilities and finding appropriate ways to use them. There was a knock on her door. Elena folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer alongside the first letter Victor had left her, the one she'd read at his funeral. Together, they represented her father's complete guidance, permission to step away from reconnaissance work, and a challenge not to hide in the process. She opened the door to find Colonel Rains standing in the corridor, his expression a mixture of concern and expectation. "Did you read it?" he asked simply. "Yes, sir. And?" Elena met his gaze directly, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't try to diminish herself or deflect attention. "And I think we need to talk about what meaningful service at Fort Draven might actually look like, not for the person I was pretending to be, but for the person I actually am." Rains smiled, a genuine expression of satisfaction and perhaps relief. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Colonel Thorne and I have been discussing some possibilities. Are you ready to hear them?" "Yes, sir." "I am." It wasn't a return to her old life, but it was an end to hiding. And as Victor had promised in his letter, there was a path forward that honored both her capabilities and her choices. Elena stepped out of her quarters and followed Colonel Rains toward that path, toward whatever came next, toward authentic service instead of fearful invisibility. The transformation was complete. Phantom had become Elena, again not the invisible logistics coordinator, but the full person she actually was, ready to contribute at her actual level in ways that aligned with her actual values. It had taken a violent confrontation to force the issue. But perhaps, as Victor had suggested, some growth only happens when we're forced to confront the gaps between who we are and who we're pretending to be. That confrontation had happened. The growth could begin. 3 days after the incident in the corridor, Colonel Thorne convened a base-wide assembly in Fort Draven's main auditorium. Attendance was mandatory for all personnel officers, enlisted, support staff, and tactical units. The auditorium, which typically hosted training presentations and ceremonial events, was filled to capacity with nearly 800 personnel, seated in rows that stretched from the stage to the back wall. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew why they were there. Word had spread throughout the installation about Captain Vale's assault on Lieutenant Kovač, about the court-martial proceedings that had already begun, and about the revelation that the quiet logistics officer everyone had dismissed for 6 months was actually a legendary reconnaissance operator. The story had taken on mythic proportions in the 3 days since the incident, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some versions claimed Elena had been a special forces operator who had conducted solo missions behind enemy lines. Others suggested she had been part of black operations that didn't officially exist. A few stories were closer to the truth, but most were exaggerations built on speculation and incomplete information. What everyone agreed on was that they had been completely wrong about who Elena Kovač was, and that Captain Vale's behavior had been inexcusable. Elena sat in the front row alongside the senior leadership colonels Thorne, Rains, Morrison, and Chun. She wore her dress uniform rather than the standard duty fatigue she typically favored. The bruise on her face had faded to a yellowish discoloration that makeup couldn't fully conceal, a visible reminder of what had precipitated this assembly. She was uncomfortable being displayed in front of the entire base, but she understood the necessity. What had happened to her wasn't just about one officer's assault. It was symptomatic of a larger cultural problem that needed to be addressed publicly and directly. Colonel Thorne approached the podium, and the auditorium fell silent. Her presence commanded immediate attention. This was a leader with 3 decades of military service, multiple combat deployments, and a reputation for uncompromising standards. 3 days ago, Thorne began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system. An incident occurred in this installation that has forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our organizational culture. Captain Marcus Vale physically assaulted a fellow commissioned officer in a public corridor. This assault was witnessed by dozens of personnel and captured on security cameras. The evidence is irrefutable, and Captain Vale is currently confined awaiting court-martial. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. That assault was criminal and completely unacceptable. But it didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in an environment that we, the senior leadership of this installation, allowed to develop. An environment where mockery of support personnel was normalized, where dismissive behavior toward non-combat roles was accepted, and where an officer felt comfortable escalating harassment because he believed the culture would protect him. Thorne's gaze swept across the assembled personnel, making eye contact with various sections of the auditorium. We failed. I failed. We created conditions where talented, dedicated officers could be systematically diminished, where cruel nicknames were treated as harmless humor, and where the value of different forms of service was measured solely by proximity to combat operations. She gestured toward Elena. Lieutenant Elena Kovač has served at Fort Draven for 6 months. During that time, she processed thousands of requisitions, coordinated complex supply chains, maintained critical equipment systems, and supported the operations of every unit on this base. Her work was consistently excellent, zero inventory discrepancies, perfect on-time delivery rates, and innovative solutions to chronic supply problems. Thorne paused again. And during that same 6 months, many of you, perhaps most of you, called her Quartermaster Know-Nothing. You treated her contributions as insignificant. You dismissed her competence as mere desk work. Some of you actively mocked her. And leadership allowed it to happen because we were blind to the cultural rot that was developing under our watch. The auditorium was absolutely silent now. Personnel who had participated in the mockery looked uncomfortable. Others who had witnessed it without objecting seemed equally troubled. Even those who had never directly engaged with Elena were recognizing their complicity in allowing the culture to exist. What most of you didn't know, Thorne continued, is that Lieutenant Kovač served 8 years in the Specialized Reconnaissance Regiment before requesting transfer to support positions. Her call sign was Phantom. She conducted operations in some of the most dangerous territories in multiple theaters. She received commendations for valor, led reconnaissance teams, and was considered one of the most capable operators in an elite unit that accepts less than 5% of candidates. A murmur rippled through the auditorium. Even those who had heard rumors were confronting the reality that their assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. She chose to leave that work, Thorne said firmly. Not because she couldn't do it, but because she decided there were other ways to serve that better aligned with her values and circumstances. That choice deserves respect, not mockery. The fact that she chose support work over elite operations doesn't diminish her value. It demonstrates wisdom about understanding your own limits and honoring them. Colonel Rains stood and joined Thorne at the podium. I served alongside Lieutenant Kovač's father, Colonel Victor Kovač, for 3 decades. Victor was one of the finest tactical minds our military has ever produced. He was also one of the most humble and service-oriented officers I've known. He taught Elena that true strength isn't about seeking recognition. It's about serving effectively regardless of whether anyone notices. Rains looked directly at the assembled personnel. Elena embodied that teaching. She served with excellence while accepting mockery. She maintained professional standards while being systematically dismissed. She chose dignity over defending herself. And she only revealed her actual capabilities when circumstances absolutely demanded it, not to prove a point, but because it was necessary. He gestured toward the audience. How many of you made assumptions about her competence based solely on her position? How many of you participated in the mockery, actively or passively? How many of you failed to recognize that the quiet officer processing your requisitions was more qualified than most people in this auditorium? The question hung in the air, unanswered but powerful. Personnel throughout the auditorium were engaging in uncomfortable self-reflection, recognizing their own participation in the toxic culture that had been exposed. Colonel Morrison stepped forward next. Going forward, Fort Draven will implement comprehensive changes to address these cultural issues. First, we're establishing a dignity and respect training program that all personnel will complete within 30 days. This isn't optional, and it isn't a box-checking exercise. We're going to fundamentally change how we think about different forms of service. He consulted a tablet. Second, we're creating an integrated training approach that brings tactical and support personnel together in realistic exercises. Too many combat operators don't understand what support work actually requires, and too many support personnel don't understand operational realities. That gap breeds the kind of dismissive attitudes we've seen here. Third, Colonel Chun added, joining the others at the podium, we're implementing a zero-tolerance policy for harassment based on military specialty. Nicknames, jokes, or comments that diminish someone's contribution based on their role will result in immediate corrective action. We're not interested in debate about whether something was just humor. If it's creating a hostile environment, it stops. Thorne reclaimed the microphone. These changes are starting immediately, but they require buy-in from every person in this auditorium. Leadership can set policy, but culture is created by the daily actions of every individual. If you see dismissive behavior, address it. If you hear demeaning comments, challenge them. If you witness harassment, report it. She paused, then made direct eye contact with several tactical unit officers in the front rows. I want to be especially clear with our combat personnel. You are exceptionally trained, and your contributions are vital. But you are not more valuable than the people who supply your equipment. Maintain your weapons, coordinate your communications, provide your medical care, or handle the thousands of other tasks that enable your operations. Excellence comes in many forms. It's time we recognize that. Colonel Rains spoke again, his voice gentler now. Lieutenant Kovač could have responded to months of mockery by revealing her background and embarrassing everyone who had dismissed her. She could have used her connections and reputation to make life difficult for those who treated her poorly. She did neither of those things. Instead, she maintained her dignity, continued serving with excellence, and only revealed her capabilities when circumstances demanded it. He looked at Elena, who was sitting quietly in the front row, her expression neutral but her discomfort visible to those who knew what to look for. That level of maturity and self-control is rare. It's also exactly the kind of leadership behavior we should be modeling and celebrating. Elena, would you please join us? Elena hesitated for a moment, then stood and walked to the podium. 800 pairs of eyes followed her movement. She could see Sergeant Reeves in the tactical unit section, his expression respectful and perhaps apologetic. Private Chun sat with the communications personnel, her face showing gratitude and relief. Sergeant Delgado was with the motor pool section. Nodding with approval. And scattered throughout the auditorium were the dozens of personnel who had used the nickname Quartermaster Know Nothing, who had made dismissive comments, who had participated actively or passively in creating an environment that diminished her contributions. Thorne handed the microphone to Elena. Lieutenant Kovač has agreed to say a few words. I want everyone to listen carefully. Elena took the microphone, her hand steady despite the anxiety she felt about public speaking. She had briefed military operations to small groups of elite operators, but she had never addressed an audience this large. For a moment, she considered what Victor would say in this situation, how he would balance honesty with grace, accountability with forward movement. Thank you, Colonel, Elena began, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the sound system. I want to start by saying that I don't want anyone to feel personally attacked or excessively guilty about what happened over the past 6 months. The culture that developed here isn't any individual's fault. It's the result of systematic patterns that many military organizations struggle with. She paused, gathering her thoughts. When I arrived at Fort Draven, I made a conscious choice to serve quietly. I deliberately didn't emphasize my background or capabilities, because I was trying to create a different kind of life for myself, one focused on useful work rather than recognition or advancement. That was my choice, and I don't regret it. However, Elena continued, her voice strengthening slightly, my choice to be modest about my background doesn't justify how I was treated. And more importantly, my specific situation isn't really what this is about. It's about how we value different types of work and how we treat people whose contributions don't fit our narrow definitions of what's important. She looked across the auditorium, making eye contact with various sections. I've served in both elite operational roles and support positions. I can tell you from direct experience that both require sophisticated skills. Both are essential to mission success, and both deserve respect. The operator conducting reconnaissance in denied territory depends absolutely on the logistics coordinator, who ensured the right equipment was available, the communications specialist who configured the right frequencies, and the medical technician who prepared the right supplies. Those dependencies run both directions, Elena said. Support personnel need combat operators to understand operational realities so we can provide appropriate support. But combat operators need to understand that support work isn't simple or unskilled, it's complex, demanding, and absolutely critical. She glanced at Colonel Thorne, then back to the audience. What happened with Captain Vale was extreme, but it was predictable given the culture that had developed. When we normalize mockery, when we treat dismissiveness as acceptable humor, when we create hierarchies of value based solely on job specialty, we create conditions where harassment escalates. Captain Vale didn't assault me because he suddenly became violent. He assaulted me because months of accepted behavior had convinced him that disrespecting support personnel carried no consequences. The auditorium remained absolutely silent, personnel absorbing the directness of Elena's assessment. Going forward, Elena continued, I'm going to be serving in a different capacity here at Fort Draven. Colonel Thorne has asked me to help redesign our integrated training programs and to work with units on developing better understanding of cross-functional operations. I'm going to be more visible, more vocal, and more willing to share my experience. She smiled slightly, a rare expression that softened her normally serious demeanor. I'm also going to be less tolerant of dismissive behavior. Not just toward me, but toward anyone. If I hear support personnel being mocked, I'm going to address it. If I see tactical units showing disrespect for the people who enable their operations, I'm going to challenge it. And I hope all of you will do the same. Elena handed the microphone back to Thorne. Thank you for your time. The auditorium erupted in applause, spontaneous, sustained, and seemingly genuine. Personnel stood, the applause growing louder. Sergeant Reeves was among the first to stand, followed quickly by most of the tactical units. Private Chun was clapping enthusiastically, tears visible on her face. Even officers who had participated in the mockery were standing and applauding. Recognizing the grace with which Elena had addressed a situation that could have been handled punitively, Elena returned to her seat. Uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding its necessity. This wasn't about celebrating her, it was about marking a transition point for Fort Draven's culture. Colonel Thorne let the applause continue for nearly a minute before raising her hand for silence. One final note before we dismiss. Captain Vale's court-martial will proceed according to military justice regulations. But beyond his individual accountability, every person in this auditorium bears responsibility for the culture we created. The changes we're implementing aren't punishment, they're opportunities to become better versions of ourselves and to build an organization we can be genuinely proud of. She surveyed the assembly one final time. Dismissed. Department heads report to the conference room in 30 minutes for implementation planning. As personnel filed out of the auditorium, many approached Elena, some offering apologies, others expressing respect. A few asking questions about her background or the changes that were coming. She handled each interaction with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout her time at Fort Draven. Accepting apologies without demanding them and deflecting excessive praise. Sergeant Reeves waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I participated in mockery, and I should have known better. I was trained by people who valued all forms of service, and I failed to maintain those standards." Elena met his gaze directly. "Apology accepted, Sergeant. Going forward, I'll need senior NCOs like you to help model the changes we're implementing. Are you willing?" "Absolutely, ma'am. Whatever you need." Private Chun approached next, her voice trembling slightly. "Lieutenant Kovač, thank you. Not just for what you said today, but for standing up for me when Captain Vale when he was threatening me. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Elena replied gently. "You were following correct procedures, and you deserved support. That's what leadership actually means, protecting people who are doing the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable or risky." As the auditorium cleared, Elena stood alone for a moment, looking at the empty seats where 800 personnel had just witnessed a fundamental shift in Fort Draven's culture. The transformation wasn't complete. Cultural change takes time, consistency, and sustained effort. But the foundation had been laid. She touched Victor's watch on her wrist, thinking about his letter. He had challenged her to stop hiding, to find her zone of optimal contribution, to serve authentically rather than invisibly. This was the beginning of that authentic service. Not a return to reconnaissance operations, but a new kind of work that used her full capabilities, while honoring the boundaries she had established. The choice had been made. Now came the work of living it. 6 weeks after the assembly, Fort Draven looked much the same from the outside. Same snow-covered training grounds, same rugged mountain backdrop, same daily rhythms of military life. But beneath the surface, fundamental shifts were occurring in how the installation operated and how personnel interacted with each other. Elena stood in the newly designated Integrated Operations Center, a facility that had previously been underutilized storage space but was now being transformed into a hub for cross-functional training. The room was filled with equipment stations representing different military specialties, communications arrays, medical simulation areas, logistics coordination terminals, and tactical planning spaces. The design was intentional, forcing personnel from different backgrounds to work side by side, understanding each other's challenges and capabilities. Lieutenant Kovač, a young lieutenant from the engineering corps, approached tentatively. I'm Marcus Webb. I'm scheduled to begin the cross-functional training module today, but I'm not sure where to start. Elena turned from the equipment she was inspecting and offered a slight smile. Welcome, Lieutenant Webb. The training starts with a scenario brief in about 10 minutes. Take a seat at any of the planning stations and review the preliminary mission documents on the tablets. Webb nodded and moved to comply, but then hesitated. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Of course. How did you do it? Serve here for 6 months while everyone treated you like you didn't matter, and not let it make you bitter or angry? Elena considered the question carefully. It was one she'd been asked in various forms dozens of times over the past weeks, by junior officers seeking guidance, by senior leaders trying to understand resilience, by enlisted personnel curious about her mindset. I did not let it affect me, Elena replied honestly. It did affect me. Some days were harder than others. But I had clarity about why I was here and what I was trying to accomplish. I was serving in a way that aligned with my values and circumstances, even if others didn't understand or respect that choice. Their opinions didn't change the value of the work I was doing. But weren't you tempted to just tell people who you really were? To make them respect you? Respect earned through revelation of past achievements isn't real respect, Elena said. It's just people recalibrating their assumptions based on new information. Real respect comes from how you conduct yourself day by day, regardless of your credentials. I didn't need Captain Vale or anyone else to respect me in order to have value. My value existed independent of their recognition. Webb nodded slowly, processing this perspective. That's actually really helpful, ma'am. Thank you. Over the next hour, 20 officers and senior enlisted personnel from various specialties arrived for the training module. The group included tactical operators, communication specialists, medical personnel, logistics coordinators, and intelligence analysts. Under the old Fort Draven culture, these groups rarely interacted meaningfully. Today, they would be forced to work together on a complex scenario that required all their specialties to succeed. Colonel Rains entered to observe the training, taking a position along the back wall where he could watch without interfering. He caught Elena's eye and nodded with approval. This was exactly the kind of integrated approach they had discussed in the weeks following the assembly. Elena called the group to attention and began the brief. Today's scenario involves a humanitarian assistance operation in a contested region. Your team has been tasked with delivering critical medical supplies to a civilian population while navigating complex security threats, infrastructure challenges, and coordination requirements with multiple agencies. She activated the display screens showing the operational area, a realistic terrain model with notional threat locations, infrastructure damage, and civilian population centers. You have limited resources, imperfect intelligence, and time pressure. Success requires every specialty in this room to contribute their expertise effectively. Failure to integrate properly will result in mission failure, which in this scenario means civilians don't receive life-saving medical care. The tactical operators in the group looked confident. They were accustomed to complex scenarios. But as Elena continued the brief, revealing the depth of logistical constraints, communications challenges, and medical considerations, their expressions shifted to something more thoughtful. You'll notice, Elena said, that the scenario has no single tactical solution. You can't shoot your way to success. This mission requires supply chain expertise to ensure resources arrive when needed, communication skill to coordinate with multiple parties, medical knowledge to prioritize treatments, and tactical awareness to navigate security threats. Every specialty is equally critical. She divided them into integrated teams, deliberately mixing specialties and ranks to force collaboration across traditional boundaries. You have 2 hours to develop your operations plan. At the end, you'll brief your approach, and we'll run through the scenario to identify what works and what doesn't. Begin. The room erupted into activity as teams gathered around their planning stations. Elena circulated among them, observing dynamics and occasionally asking challenging questions that forced teams to confront assumptions or consider overlooked factors. At one station, a tactical officer was dominating the conversation, trying to apply pure combat solutions to problems that required different approaches. Elena intervened gently. "Captain, what's your logistics coordinator saying about supply timelines?" The captain looked at the logistics specialist on his team, a quiet sergeant, who had been trying unsuccessfully to raise concerns. "Sergeant?" "Sir, the supply route you're planning requires crossing a damaged bridge that can't support heavy vehicles. We'd need to use smaller trucks and make multiple trips, which changes your timeline significantly." The tactical captain's expression shifted as he realized his plan had a fatal flaw that non-tactical expertise had identified. "Thank you, Sergeant. Let's redesign around that constraint." Elena moved to another station where a communications specialist was explaining frequency coordination requirements to a team that included 2 infantry officers who looked skeptical about the complexity. "Why can't we just use standard tactical frequencies?" one officer asked, clearly thinking the communications specialist was overcomplicating things. The specialist, emboldened by the new Fort Draven culture that valued expertise regardless of specialty, pushed back politely but firmly. "Sir, because this operation involves coordination with civilian aid agencies, local security forces, and medical evacuation assets. Each group operates on different systems with different protocols. If we don't pre-coordinate frequencies and establish proper communications architecture, we'll have units unable to talk to each other at critical moments." The infantry officer nodded, beginning to appreciate the sophistication required. "Okay, walk me through what that coordination looks like." By the end of the 2-hour planning period, every team had developed comprehensive operations plans that genuinely integrated different specialties. When they began presenting their approaches, the quality of thinking was notable. These weren't tactical plans with support considerations tacked on, but truly integrated approaches where every specialty contributed meaningfully. After the presentations, Elena led a detailed after-action discussion. "What did you learn today that surprised you?" A tactical officer spoke up. "I learned that logistics constraints are just as important as tactical considerations. I've always known intellectually that we need supplies, but I didn't really understand the complexity of making that happen in degraded conditions." A logistics specialist added, "I learned that tactical personnel face decision-making pressures that I hadn't fully appreciated. Understanding their operational tempo helps me prioritize what's truly urgent versus what's just preferred." A medical technician contributed, "I learned that my expertise needs to be communicated clearly to non-medical personnel. I can't assume people understand medical priorities. I need to explain them in terms that relate to operational outcomes." The discussion continued for another 30 minutes, with personnel from different specialties recognizing both the value of others' expertise and the importance of communicating their own knowledge effectively. Colonel Rains approached as the training session concluded and personnel departed. "That was impressive, Elena. You've created exactly the kind of learning environment we needed." "It's a start, sir," Elena replied. "Cultural change takes time and consistency. One training module doesn't undo years of embedded attitudes." "No, but it plants seeds. And you're modeling the behavior we need, respecting every specialty, demanding integrated thinking, holding everyone to high standards regardless of their background." Elena glanced at her watch, Victor's watch, which she now wore not as a burden but as a simple reminder to use her time purposefully. I have a meeting with Major Weston in 20 minutes to discuss restructuring the logistics department's training program. He's been receptive to changes. He should be. The metrics from the past 6 weeks show dramatic improvements in supply efficiency and equipment readiness. Turns out when you stop treating logistics as an afterthought and start properly resourcing it, things work better. Rain smiled. Who would have thought? As Elena gathered her materials and prepared to leave the training center, Private Chun appeared at the doorway. She had been promoted to specialist in the weeks following the incident, a recognition of her competence that had been delayed by the previous toxic culture. "Ma'am, do you have a minute?" "Of course, Specialist Chun." Chun entered, looking both excited and nervous. "I've been accepted into the officer candidate program. I'll be starting training next quarter." Elena felt genuine pleasure at the news. "That's excellent. You'll make a fine officer." "I wouldn't have applied without what happened," Chun admitted. "Seeing you stand up to Captain Vale, watching how you handled everything with dignity and strength, it made me realize I could aspire to leadership too. That my technical expertise had value beyond just being a good technician." "Your expertise always had that value," Elena corrected gently. "What changed was your recognition of it." "Maybe, but you showed me what that recognition looks like in practice." Chun hesitated, then continued. "There's something else. The officer candidate board asked me about the incident, about what I witnessed and what I learned from it. I told them that I learned true leadership isn't about rank or position. It's about acting with integrity when circumstances demand it, even when that's uncomfortable or risky. That's a good lesson to carry into your officer career. I also told them I want to serve like you do, using my full capabilities while maintaining the kind of character that values all contributions, not just the ones that get recognition." Chun's voice wavered slightly with emotion. "You probably don't realize how many people you've influenced, just by being who you are and handling this situation the way you did." Elena was uncomfortable with this level of praise but understood its sincerity. Just make sure your leadership is authentic to who you are, not an imitation of someone else. Take the principles but apply them in your own way. After Chun departed, Elena walked through Fort Draven's corridors toward her meeting with Major Weston. The changes in atmosphere were subtle but noticeable. Personnel greeted each other with more genuine respect. Conversations between tactical and support units had a different quality, more collaborative, less hierarchical. The nicknames and dismissive comments that had been ubiquitous 6 weeks ago had largely disappeared, replaced by professional courtesy and recognition of expertise. It wasn't perfect. Cultural change never is. There were still pockets of resistance, still individuals who clung to old attitudes, still moments when someone would slip into dismissive behavior before catching themselves. But the trajectory was clear and positive. Major Weston was waiting in his office when Elena arrived. The logistics department had undergone significant reorganization in recent weeks, new training protocols, updated procedures, and most importantly, a renewed sense of value and purpose among personnel who had previously felt like background furniture. "Elena, come in," Weston greeted her warmly. "I've been reviewing the proposals you submitted for the advanced logistics training curriculum. They're ambitious, but exactly what we need. Getting approval and funding might take some time, but I'm confident we can make this happen." They spent the next hour discussing details, how to structure training that would develop strategic thinking alongside technical skills, how to create career paths that properly valued logistics expertise, how to ensure support personnel received the kind of professional development that combat units took for granted. As the meeting concluded, Weston leaned back in his chair. "Can I tell you something? When you first arrived 6 months ago, I thought you were competent but unremarkable. Just another officer doing solid work in a support role. I'm embarrassed to admit that I never looked deeper. Never questioned why someone with your qualifications would be in such a basic position. You weren't alone in that assessment. Sir, no, but I should have been better. I'm your direct supervisor. I should have recognized your capabilities and created opportunities for you to contribute more meaningfully. He paused. I'm grateful that despite my failure to see you clearly, you're still willing to help transform this department. The past is past. Major, what matters now is what we build going forward. Elena left Weston's office and made her way to her quarters as the winter sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across Fort Draven. Inside her room, she opened her desk drawer and removed both of Victor's letters, the one she had read at his funeral 3 years ago, and the one Colonel Rains had delivered 6 weeks ago. She read them both again, slowly, letting her father's words wash over her with new understanding. Victor had known she would try to hide after his death. He had understood her need to step away from reconnaissance work, but he had also known that hiding completely would slowly erode her sense of purpose and value. His wisdom had been proved correct. The 6 months she spent serving invisibly at Fort Draven had been peaceful in some ways, but ultimately hollow. She had been useful but not fulfilled, competent but not engaged, present but not truly alive. The confrontation with Vale had been painful and traumatic, but it had also been catalytic. It had forced her to stop hiding and start serving authentically, using her full capabilities while maintaining appropriate boundaries, contributing at her actual level while honoring her choice to avoid direct combat operations. She was finding her zone of optimal contribution, exactly as Victor had challenged her to do. Not by returning to the SRR, but by creating a new kind of service that used her reconnaissance experience, her strategic thinking, her understanding of operations, and her commitment to developing others. Elena placed the letters back in her desk drawer, alongside a new addition, a commendation letter from Colonel Thorne, recognizing her contributions to Fort Draven's cultural transformation and the positive impact of her integrated training programs. It was the first official recognition she had received in 3 years. And while she didn't need external validation, it represented something important: acknowledgement that her current work had value equal to her previous reconnaissance operations. There was a knock on her door. Elena opened it to find Sergeant Delgado from the motor pool, holding a small package. "Evening, ma'am. This arrived for you through official channels. Looks like it came from the Kandarian Peace Gardens Memorial Foundation." Elena accepted the package with surprise. She hadn't had any contact with the foundation since Victor's death. Inside was a formal invitation embossed with the foundation's seal. "Lieutenant Elena Kovač, you are cordially invited to speak at the annual Kandarian Memorial Ceremony, honoring individuals who survived the Civil War and subsequently contributed meaningfully to society. Your father, Colonel Victor Kovač, was a longtime supporter of our foundation and spoke at our ceremony multiple times. We understand you have recently emerged from a period of private service to take on leadership roles developing integrated training programs and promoting cultural change within the military. Your journey from refugee to reconnaissance operator to cultural leader embodies exactly the kind of transformation we celebrate at our ceremony. We would be honored if you would share your story with attendees, particularly young refugees who are looking for examples of how to build meaningful lives from traumatic beginnings." Elena stared at the invitation for a long time. Speaking publicly about her journey was exactly the kind of visibility she had been avoiding for 3 years. It would mean acknowledging her past, discussing her time in the SRR, explaining her choices, and becoming a public figure in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. But she could hear Victor's voice in her mind. The ceremony isn't for people who hide their stories. It's for people who acknowledge their journeys and let others learn from them. She thought about Specialist Chun, who had been inspired to pursue officer candidacy by watching Elena handle difficult circumstances with integrity. She thought about Lieutenant Webb, who had asked how to serve with dignity when others didn't recognize your value. She thought about all the young officers and enlisted personnel at Fort Draven, who were now approaching their service differently, because they had witnessed authentic leadership during a crisis. Her story might inspire others facing similar struggles. Her willingness to be vulnerable about her journey might give someone else permission to acknowledge their own complicated paths. Elena sat at her desk and began drafting her acceptance letter to the Foundation. It wouldn't be comfortable. It would require a level of public exposure she had spent 3 years avoiding. But it would be honest, and it would be purposeful. And it would honor Victor's belief that transformation meant something only when shared with others who needed to see what was possible. Have you ever been invisible for so long that people forgot you had value? Have you ever watched someone finally recognize your worth, only after circumstances forced them to pay attention? Share in the comments if you've ever had to choose between comfortable hiding and uncomfortable authenticity. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is stop pretending to be less than we are. Elena finished the acceptance letter and sealed it in an envelope. Tomorrow she would mail it, officially committing to stepping fully into visibility and accepting the responsibilities that came with acknowledging her complete story, the transformation that had begun with Vale's assault 6 weeks ago was continuing. Not just for Fort Draven, but for Elena herself. She was becoming the person Victor had always known she could be, someone who served meaningfully without seeking glory, who protected others without requiring recognition, who used her capabilities appropriately while maintaining her values, and who finally, after 3 years of hiding, was willing to be seen. Not everyone who carries a powerful past needs to be celebrated. But some people's journeys contain lessons that others desperately need to hear. Elena had been that person all along. The question had never been whether she had value. It had always been whether she would acknowledge that value and let it serve purposes larger than her own comfort. She had chosen acknowledgement. She had chosen service. She had chosen authenticity over invisibility. And in making that choice, she had honored both Victor's memory and her own hard-won wisdom about what it means to serve with integrity. The quiet woman who had once hidden in the shadows of Fort Draven was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true strength sometimes means being willing to be seen, not for glory, but for the possibility that your story might help someone else find their way forward. 4 colonels had witnessed a captain strike her. What they did next changed everything, not through brutality, but through justice, cultural transformation, and the recognition that excellence comes in many forms. That sometimes what the world needs to change isn't someone demanding recognition. It's someone who doesn't need to be recognized at all until the moment demands otherwise. Elena Kovač was that person. And Fort Draven, along with everyone who would hear her story at the Kandarian memorial ceremony, was better for finally seeing who she had always been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.